Hello? Do you hear me? Do you hear something? Yeah.
Nick's going to sit on my laptop.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to our EuropaBON final conference. And we're very proud to present our results, but we're also proud to present the proposal for the European Biodiversity Observation Conservation Coordination Center. And but first of all, before we have the greetings, we would like to, so my name is EuropaBON. I'm Professor for Biodiversity and People at IDIV and the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research and the University of Jena. And together with Ian, we're leading the stakeholder work package of EuropaBON. Pass over to you.
Yes, thank you, Letta. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Also, warm welcome from my side. Ian McCallum from EASA. I'm a researcher at EASA and working very closely with Letta in EuropaBON on the aspect of stakeholder engagement, and also a big thanks to all of you who have participated in this process over the last 3+ years, and it's been really successful, a really successful journey. I'd also like to say a big thanks to the Work Package 2 team, all the colleagues working very hard behind the scenes and organizing all of these events, and we'll be thanking them as well later. But we want to get going and move on with the event, so I'll hand it back to Letta, and I think we're going to invite Henrik for a few welcome words.
Okay, just to let you, yeah, okay. Okay. So, first of all, we would like to welcome the chair, Henrik Pereira, who's Professor of Conservation Biology at IDIV, and who is the chair of EuropaBON, and I hand over to you straight away. I think you're known in the community, so thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I
think you don't need
yes,
exactly.
Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to the final stakeholders conference of EuropaBON. It's really wonderful that we had this beautiful setting here that the Museum of Natural History here in Brussels allowed us to use for this event. And I think it's also very emblematic because there cannot be biodiversity monitoring without strong natural history museums in Europe. So we are very happy to hold here in the capital of Europe, in the Museum of Natural History of the capital of Europe, the final stakeholders conference. We were going to have this afternoon a final balance of EuropaBON. What were the main results from this project that started 3 years ago? And we have the great pleasure of having two very distinguished speakers, Humberto Rosa and Sala Sassas-Moinan, that will give a perspective on, let's say, the state of biodiversity monitoring in Europe, the importance, and how it connects both to the DG Environment and JRC activities. I'll then have a presentation of an overview of the project. Then we have a coffee break, and then after coffee break, we go into some more detailed presentations of the project, of the different work packages of the project, and we will conclude with the presentation on the final proposal of the project for a biodiversity observation coordination center at European level, with then some questions and a session of questions and answers about that. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome the first speaker, Mr. Humberto Delgado Rosa. He's Director for Biodiversity at the European Commission, Director General for Environment. Previously, he was the Director at DG Climate, and previously he was Secretary of State for the Environment of Portuguese government. And I must say that my greatest honor in my professional life was serving under him when I was working as a Director of National Protected Areas in Northern Portugal, and it was an outstanding experience. And previous, he was a scientific advisor to the current Secretary General of the United Nations when he was Prime Minister Antonio Guterres. Humberto, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Obrigado, Henrique. Thank you very much for your kind words and also for this invitation. Not only I'm really pleased to join you in this final conference of EuropaBON for obvious reasons. I'm dealing with biodiversity now for some years, including in the Commission, but I actually think this is very timely, the moment to have this conference. So I won't go much into the science of it because you're the experts, but I will try to do a bit of a link between what you are discussing and have been doing and the policy context in relation to biodiversity and beyond. And the first thing to say is, well, we have more and more evidence that we humans, while we have developed fantastically in the world, that has come with a cost. And the cost, very simply put, is biosphere degradation. It's not just climate change or not just pollution, not just biodiversity loss. It's all together in one single fact, which is we degrade the atmosphere, the land and the oceans, which means degrading the biosphere, of which we strictly depend. So these are the hard facts we have also from science. Now, of course, when things are very well known on science, but not in wider society, there's here a gap of awareness. But anyway, I think we can say this awareness gap has kind of diluted to a certain extent. And to give the example I prefer is the World Economic Forum, which is not really environmentalists, and they have their global risk assessment year per year. The last one I've seen, risks for the next 10 years, 4 top ones are climate and biodiversity or natural resources, and the 10th is pollution on 10 years. So the biggest risks for business, for the economy, let alone all the rest. Of course, if you look to risks of only 2 years, things change a bit. But for 10 years, it's very telling how there's some awareness that goes beyond the scientific world per se, extends certainly to the economic world and the business world, and it also reaches out public opinion in general, not least because nature's invoices are coming. We see them almost daily, normally floods or something else, but it's not unrelated to nature, because we all know we cannot just look to climate and there's something different, which is nature, because it goes so strictly interconnected, be it for prevention of floods or for having water against droughts, how much we rely on nature, trees and so forth. So in a sense, I think there has been, well, yes, degradation, but also more social perception that something is wrong and something needs to be done. And in my interpretation, that explains why somehow unexpectedly, in the end of 2022, surprise, the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed under the Convention on Biological Diversity was really something different than usual. And the main difference, in my view, is because it brought in an MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification regime that was non-existent practically for biodiversity, while we had something quite robust and the Paris Agreement for climate change. And I interpret this as, let's say, that was in spite of the war in Ukraine and inflation and after COVID, etc., there was still capacity enough in that room of negotiation to have something different. Now, a bit contradictory to everything I'm saying, at least in Europe, but not only, but certainly in Europe, we are now facing a certain anti-green wave that we see daily. Farmers are in the streets right now saying the Green Deal causes them to not have income. By the way, they have difficulties of income, not because of the Green Deal, but that's another point I won't discuss now. But we do face a wave of populism, etc., that brings in the simple solutions, denies the problems, and these can all go away. And the usual victim is biodiversity policy, because it's seen as the minor part. Yes, climate change is important, but nature is not. It is obviously wrong, because you cannot link those. Just think about the so-called LULUCF regulation, land use, land change, and forestry. What does it require now for member states? More carbon-based things. What are those? Nature. The best technology you have to pump CO2 out of the atmosphere is photosynthesis, and plants self-replicate, machines don't. So we are indeed, I wanted, this intro point was to show this is timely, because all the solution those for action, but also to counteract the political, the anti-green wave, does rely on knowledge, on monitoring, reporting, verification. Anyway, make no mistakes, biodiversity policy is not going away. First, because we have some robust legislation on the ground. Yes, it will be attacked politically, but it is still there. The Birds and Habitats Directives, for instance. We also have commitments that are quite binding politically, to start with the international commitments under the Global Biodiversity Framework, but also at EU level, the commitments in the biodiversity strategy to 2030, which has quite some quantification, protected areas, favorable conservation status of protected species, etc., restoration. So at this stage, we don't know yet if we will have something Europe really needs, which is a nature restoration law, but we can still have it. But make no mistake, even if it does not advance now, we will need it. It will come somehow. We do need restoration. So this is to say that all these fronts I'm referring require and benefit from monitoring, from data, so as to ensure the accountability and the transparency of the policy. Otherwise, it does not really go ahead. So now getting into the follow-up of what EuropaBON has been doing and what we can expect as further biodiversity observation and monitoring. So to have it regular reporting and quality data underpinned by systematic observation of biodiversity on the ground in all the ecosystems, freshwater, marine, terrestrial, over a long time frame is fundamental. We are dealing, yes, with quite a high level of complexity when we deal with biodiversity. I usually say much easier to measure tons of CO2 than ecosystem services for sure. But we need it, and the methodology, that's what we're doing. The methodology is the way to do it, is coming up. So in essence, we need to improve the timeliness, the availability, the quality, the coherence, and the access to biodiversity data, which does allow what, if we get to this? It allows first to monitor the progress to our commitments. All these commitments, be it EU level, national level, or international, are meaningless if we cannot really monitor and know who's getting close to them or not, including for existing environmental legislation that we have. Then this would also allow to support the design and assessment of the measures to protect and attain resilient ecosystems and their services, including from the angle of climate mitigation adaptation, which won't be less important. And was also very importantly, to allow to support the integration of biodiversity and climate aspects in impact assessments and evaluations of other sorts for other policies. These are the elements we do need if we get to this improvement on data quality. So for this, we will need methodologies and data infrastructure, but also building on what exists. So let's avoid the temptation, oh, we need something totally different, starting from scratch. There's a lot ongoing, national level, also European level, that needs to be brought into synergy and collaboration instead of other layers of complexity. So that's why when the Parliament has proposed to prepare an action on the development and deployment of a European Biodiversity Observation Center, we as European Commission agreed that's something useful that follows up also from the recommendations of EuropaBON. We also see some opportunities for rationalization as the primary aim of this EBOC to come, improving availability and accessibility of the data at all these levels towards having a EU perspective. We also expect it to be coherent and structured in a cost-effective way. And cost is an issue on all this. It does have a money tag, but it must be as cost-efficient as possible. And what we hope the EBOC to be when it comes to fruition is a federated system that can connect the national nature conservation agencies and what they do, stakeholders networks, including those that do citizen science, and of course, research organizations, international institutes, and initiatives related to biodiversity monitoring, and several around. So functions for this future EBOC, in my view, well, the provision of guidance, methodological guidance is very useful. So that wherever in the world, including internationally, what is being done can be done in a coherent and compatible way for the sampling and collection of data. Then the coordination, integration, and harmonization of existing biodiversity observation schemes, also unlocking the potential of open data sourcing, and the publication of data and metadata towards this. So in the end, seeing very much data on biodiversity as a resource, bringing in the synergies and streamlining what already exists instead of building further complexity, and addressing the data gaps by dealing with the EU level, the national level, the citizen science level, with Earth observation as adequate, including in what may be required of infrastructure software, who knows how much artificial intelligence may help or not. So in the end, now returning a little bit to politics, we will, as EU, as the member states, as parties to the Convention of Biological Diversity, we need to cope with this set of mandatory indicators to be used by the parties in the reporting of progress of implementation, which are all data thirsty. And at this stage, we do know there are quite so many gaps, well, in Europe as elsewhere in the world, that we need to fulfill. So our mind is very much on how can we report about our gaps, and that does require this data. And I think to provide relevant indicators that you can use in the importance assessments, like the second EU ecosystem assessment, which is due in 2027, that will feed into the IPBES second global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services scheduled for 2028, is relevant. And I happen to know the IPBES will also be looking into a methodological assessment of monitoring. They are working on this right now. So what this EBOC can do, if linked with also internationally with the IPBES, would be very relevant. But my final thought, and I hope I'm not taking too long, Eric, is the following. As we see from the situation of the world, what we need is more data, not less data. But at the same time, there's a big wave, oh, please simplify because of competitiveness, because of administrative burden, because of costs and so forth, which is also true. So the solution for this, in my view, is doing our action on data, on how to link these synergies in a way that can be presented as a simplification. Ideally, if we would have coherent data integrated in open source, much of the reporting due by member states, for instance, could be just sampled directly from the net, and then member states will just verify if it was adequately sampled. So we need to keep this in mind, and you also as scientists, because just saying we need more of everything faces a wall when addressing politics. Very final is also there are other entities. I referred the national nature agencies that should be involved, the European Environmental Agency, but we do have this European Knowledge Biodiversity Center led by DGM and the JRC, where DEA and many other services also sit. And we think that this knowledge center can play quite a role also towards this EBOC and what should follow. In essence, I think the EuropaBON is providing the relevant recommendations in this sense. It was a bit of my bird's eye view of what is at stake with the linker policy. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ms. Sala Sastamoinen, the Deputy Director General of the Joint Research Center at the European Commission. Previously, she served at DG Justice and Consumers, more recently as Director of Civil and Environmental and Director of Civil and Commercial Justice. Prior to that, Mrs. Sastamoinen served as Legal Officer at DG Environment. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, also from the Joint Research Center. And thank you for the invitation to this conference. Thank you for your participation to the research project now over the 3 years. This has shown a long-standing interest to understanding the very complex subject of the biodiversity and how we are managing nature-related risks. And I'm proud that also the Joint Research Centre has been playing part of this EuropaBON project from its conceptions to these final stages. The Joint Research Centre is the science and knowledge centre, scientific service of the European Commission. We are DG, we work together with our policy DGs, that way share what Humberto already said, but we also then provide independent scientific evidence on the issues that are entrusted to us. And the scientific evidence, one of them, or to get them, one has to also observe, monitor, gather the data. And that is what we are also then talking today, is actually that how on this area of biodiversity, we have wealth of the data. Is that something that can be used for this science for policy advice that we need? And as it was said today, it's a topical moment because we are and will be giving this advice to the new Commission soon. So that way, and that will be based on data that we have now and what we are then gathering in the future. There are challenges on these areas because when we think that we need to measure the consequences, the influence of the human activities to the natural ecosystems. These are because there's no simple metrics of biodiversity and because there are multiple cause-effect mechanisms at the same time over the same ecosystems. So the work is needed. We know that the preservation of the biodiversity and the ecosystems is essential for the both planetary health and human well-being, and not to mention then the long-term socio-economic developments. Just to mention some, often we think indeed that the figures are, or that Elias has to mention some figures there. When we think at globally, more than half of the world's GDP depends on the nature and its services. Or that the global wildlife population has fallen around 70% since 1970s. Furthermore, 40% of the world's land is degraded, according to the scientists. And more than 150 tons of plastics drift in our oceans when we think about the water nature. And that is also only increasing. So the global situation from the scientific point is at risk. And that's has been now dealt with this international effort that Humberto was describing and that we are trying to do also in the European level. In Europe, we have been actually then already have a quite history of the monitoring the biodiversity trends. We have been observing the birds since 1980s, natural habitats since 1990s, and later then completed even more with aquatic and other ecosystems. This has been very much the work also of the national and regional institutions, but also in the European level, we have developed and implemented the Europe-wide monitoring systems like LUCAS, the Land Use and Cover Area Survey. That way, we have a complementary information from the national and at the European level. We aim to go further. We are developing the new capacities of the remote sensors, like in our Copernicus program, so the Earth observation is brought also more and more in the biodiversity observation. We have new technologies for in situ observation, and the growing computing and modeling capacities will be boosted by the AI. They will also enhance our horizons. So we have that type of future ahead, but to use that efficiently, we need collaboration. That will be then the driving force if we look at an innovation for the future. We are still in challenges, and I think this is something that you are coming out also with this project, these results. The challenge is that we are lacking a holistic and consistent overview on the biodiversity trends. and that we do not have then sufficiently effective and efficient funding mechanisms for the long-term policy framework. These are something what is coming. So if we are lacking then holistic and consistent overview, that means that there is data, there's actually wealth of data, as it was said, but that is not yet coordinated in a way that it can bring the best possible startup for the science for policy advice. So we need better coordination on every layer. And we need to still develop and exploit the current technologies and the digitalization possibilities to get also this better integrated view. And naturally, I mean, if there was funding missing, that's also then with the capacity building then needed in the future. So one solution that is coming now is this proposal for the EU Biodiversity Observation Coordination Center. And in this context, all the outputs of the project that also many of you have been working are very crucial. Crucial in bringing this coordination aspect forward, ensuring the collaboration between the key EU actors, and that way promoting the policy uptake. So again, thank you for everybody whom we have been working with, including the European Environment Agency, who is naturally is also one of our regular cooperation partners. And because this is based on this preparatory action, so this funding coming from the European Parliament, you know that we have then already caught the political eye. It's the Parliament who is trying to raise the issues that are missing, making the gaps where they want to give the political support. So that is something that we have to then continue working with the new Parliament when it comes and when it's then settled after the June elections. So that to see that this type of collective effort on the addressing the urgent need for coordination, need for integration, harmonization, strengthening of data collection continues to have the political support. Possible and the future coordinated work in this EBOCC that will serve the member states' needs, as I said, and we said there's a lot of monitoring is happening from the national level, but we needed the coherence then across the sectors and across then member states. So that way bring the European aspect. So this is then that would make it the data collection that is happening efficient. We have this many biodiversity communities and research infrastructures, and we do support then the existing network. So we think that one should leverage on the existing data collections, on the existing networks and build upon them so that we have the data for policy, knowledge for policy when it's necessary. We have been indeed part of this exercise through our knowledge center on the biodiversity from the side of the European Commission, and we want to also continue that. So with this type of collaboration, we believe that it is doable to find nature positive economy to act on biodiversity also in the future, and that way keep implementing the European biodiversity strategy. It is not always easy, but that's why we need the researchers and scientists. We need all of you to make this in the very close collaboration so that we have the scientific capacity of everybody put together, and through that we influence on the policies to get the power of floor then to change Europe also in the next years. So it is together that we are building on the future, and that's when I'm very happy that it continues and we go ahead with this aspect of coordination of all the knowledge that we have together. I thank you for your attention. I wish you a very fruitful conference. I'm sorry I will not be able to stay the whole time, but you have also from the Joint Research Center my colleague, excellent scientist Camino Ligete, who will be here and actually already I think in the next panel. So that way we will be represented the whole day. So thank you very much and have a very successful conference.
So thank you so much for this wonderful keynotes and that set up a bit the context for what I'm going to do. That is a bit of the balance of the last 3.5 years of the project. Let's see. Oops. This is very slow in my. Okay. So I wanted to start with something that Umberto Rosa had said, that is the importance of monitoring the context of global and European biodiversity policy. As you all know, we have currently the European Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. It is very closely connected to the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the European Biodiversity Strategy has 3 large sets of goals. One is to put biodiversity on a fast track to recovery, ensure that ecosystems continue to deliver ecosystem services in the long term, and restore degraded ecosystems by 2050, crossing the fingers that the nature restoration law will still be approved in this mandate of the Commission. But the challenge is that when you look at the implementation of this strategy and also of the Global Biodiversity Strategy, you need to monitor the success of the different actions and policies to be able to adjust those actions and policies in kind of an iterative cycle. And so there cannot be effective policy without monitoring. And monitoring has to serve the policy goals. Now, the problem is maybe illustrated in this paper we just had recently in Science. It was the largest model intercomparison done to date on biodiversity and ecosystem services models. So we brought together a team from modeling groups all over the world and looked at trying to reconstruct historical trends on biodiversity and also project biodiversity into the future using the shared socioeconomic pathways, relative concentration pathways scenarios. And what I wanted to highlight is not only the dire trend that we had in the last 100 years with major biodiversity loss almost everywhere. And this was really a century like no other. The human population increased by 4 times. The demand on land, on fresh water, and marine systems was unprecedented, increased at unprecedented rates, and that led to biodiversity loss almost everywhere. And depending on the scenario and the policies we can implement, we show that some scenarios can put us in much better paths for the future than in than other scenarios. But what I wanted to highlight here is that the individual dots, you have different metrics. The top metric there, delta S gamma, is the global extinctions. Delta S alpha is local extinctions. That is what is mapped. And in the bottom is another metric called mean habitat extent across species. But each of the dots is a model. Each of those dots is a model. And what you see is that what the models are telling you are not necessarily exactly the same. For instance, for the historical trends, in the local species regions, there's been a big controversy over the last 5-10 years in community ecology on meta-analysis of time series not finding really a significant trend on local biodiversity. And what you find there is in reality that the models encompass from, most are saying there has been a decline in local biodiversity trends, but one of the models is even positive. So we have a huge uncertainty across models in biodiversity at this moment. So we still have so much uncertainty in biodiversity model that we do require much more data. And in another paper that we did in connection to also EuropaBON, we looked at this. If we know that if we knew that the local biodiversity trends were negative, and you wanted to establish a monitoring network around the world with monitoring sites, how many sites would you need to detect the negative trend on biodiversity? And what we find out is if we had this perfect unbiased sampling that is represented by the red line there, yeah, if you had around 5,000 sites, you could probably detect negative trends. But the reality is that we don't have such unbiased monitoring systems. Most of our systems are biased towards mostly biomes or towards areas that have no large biodiversity loss, sometimes even to the most pristine ecosystems. And if you use a monitoring network based on those kind of biases, you may either not detect any trends or even detect the false trends. And this is why we really need more biodiversity monitoring, because what we have currently is not sufficient. So the Commission, that was very alert for this problem, 4 years ago launched this call, the Monitoring Ecosystems Through Research, Innovation and Technology call. And the idea was that many EU policies, as I mentioned, rely on the supply of regularly updated biodiversity data. And the challenge, of course, is how you harness the scientific advances and bring together various actors to strengthen current efforts. We also heard this from our previous speakers, that it's important to build on what exists out there and devise a cost-effective approach to monitoring, combining, it's very important, combining in situ, space, and airborne monitoring. And this action should design a EU-wide framework for monitoring biodiversity ecosystem services. So that's the call that EuropaBON addressed. And EuropaBON had this big goal of designing a EU-wide framework for monitoring biodiversity. And we have 5 work packages that structured our work. First, we had stakeholder engagement. And all the work in EuropaBON based on understanding what were the user needs, what were the policy needs regarding monitoring. We have another work package doing an assessment of what exists out there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to build on what exists out there. We have another work package on improving what is out there through co-design, working with stakeholders. And we had a demonstration work package looking at policy showcases that illustrated how the approach that we adopted in EuropaBON, that is based on this idea of integrating multiple data streams from different types through models to produce indicators and scenarios, how we could do that to support different policies. And always with this idea of innovation, cost effectiveness, and open access that we also heard from our previous speakers, it is very important. But EuropaBON is not only the 17 partners across Europe that participate in the project. Over these almost 4 years, we established a large network of members, over 1,600 members in 70 countries, most in Europe, but even outside Europe showed interest to learn about how we're doing monitoring here in Europe. And this map shows, for instance, the connectedness between all these different members across Europe. So EuropaBON, it was a collaborative research action. It went way beyond just doing the research. It went really to connect this community of scientists and practitioners around Europe. Now, the key approach that we use in EuropaBON is an approach that has been developed by GeoBON, by the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network over the last decade, that is around the concept of essential biodiversity variables. So this idea is that you identify a set of essential biodiversity variables for you to then bring together in situ observations. That will always be gaps. You can never monitor everything everywhere. But you bring those data with other sources of data, as the call for this project mentioned, remote sensing. And you use models to estimate these variables in space and time and also across different biological entities. And then you can use those nice, what we call them essential biodiversity variable cubes, to do all kind of indicators and analysis. Now, if you look at the challenges for designing a EU biodiversity monitoring system, the first challenge is to identify what are the variables you want to monitor. You need to do that in light of policy questions. And you need to answer things like what tax and ecosystems, what spatial and temporal resolution. And when you have identified that, then you need to know where and how to monitor and how to integrate the data and what models to use. So the project was designed around these aspects, both of the EBV selection and of the monitoring design EBV workflows. And the different work packages and tasks fit into these aspects. So the first, as I mentioned, everything is based on solid state stakeholder engagement. And the identification of the essential biodiversity variables was based on the stakeholder engagement process. Then we assessed the current monitoring system in light of these EBVs. We have this set of essential biodiversity variables. How are they being monitored? What are the monitoring initiatives? What are the gaps? What are the bottlenecks? What is the cost effectiveness? Then how do we do better? How do we design a new monitoring system that builds on what we have, that uses new technologies, and that delivers additional benefits? How can we demonstrate this in theory? Because this is a system that is a large system, but how can we demonstrate in a bunch of showcases? And finally, a proposal for the terms of reference of an European Biodiversity Observation Coordination Center that we'll discuss later today. Today we'll have presentations on different aspects of this work. We'll have a presentation from Daniel Kisling on the co-design effort. We'll have a presentation from Nestor Fernandez on the showcases. We'll have a presentation from Camille Liquette on the terms of reference of the European Biodiversity Observation Center. And also a presentation from Anne Solheim in one of the showcases that we had here. And so you'll get an overview of all this work that we have done in EuropaBON. But I wanted to just give you some highlights. First, on how we started all this effort at the height of the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic. And our first meeting had to be remote, because so we had a Zoom meeting where many of you participated. And that kicked off this compilation of user needs that were published in the User and Policy Needs Assessment of EuropaBON. And that policy assessment identified what were the major areas of policy, of biodiversity policy, or policy that needed biodiversity data that we had in Europe. And that guided the effort of choosing a set of essential biodiversity variables. And sometimes we get this question, why so many variables? It's about 84 that we identified. Well, because we're doing this across realms. We're doing this across terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. We're doing this across the tree of life. We cannot do a system. I love birds. I'm an avid bird watcher, but you cannot do this just for birds. We have to do this across the tree of life. We have to do this across different levels of organization, from genetic diversity to species interactions and ecosystem functioning. And when you start doing this, it's kind of a factorial thing. Yeah, one multiplies by the other, and then we end up with these 84 sets, 84 essential biodiversity variables across these three realms, across multiple aspects of biodiversity. And they really can be divided into three large groups. The first group are related to species level variables for marine, terrestrial, and freshwater species. that address the questions related to the status of species of conservation interest. For instance, our Habitats and Birds Directive have regulatory requirements that all the member states have to follow in reporting the status and trends of the species listed on those directives. And the second set of variables are ecosystem level variables, addressing questions about trends in overall ecosystem condition, and also allowing to assess progress towards restoration of ecosystems. And we do that across a range of taxonomic groups and across a range of ecosystems. And finally, a third set of variables are available for monitoring ecosystem risks, ecosystem services, and the status of invasive species. Now, all of these variables, and I wanted to emphasize the effort that we put in making everything open in our project. For instance, the descriptions of each of these EBVs is available on GitHub. And you can just go to this link and consult all these essential biodiversity variables. Now, the first thing we did was to assess how is the current biodiversity monitoring in Europe in relation to these 84 essential biodiversity variables. What is the status of coverage? And here, this is an exercise where we try to identify when they are covered. They have like these dark colors, and green is for terrestrial, this yellowish is for freshwater, and blue for marine. And across different aspects of biodiversity, from genetic composition to ecosystem functioning, where most of the variables here being assessed are on the species population, are about individual species in different taxonomic groups, either abundance or distribution of species. And what you can see is that we evaluated them according to how integrated is the data? Are there protocols for the monitoring? What is the coverage of the different entities that, so the different species or ecosystems that we'd like to cover? What is the spatial resolution? What is the temporal resolution? And what is the accessibility of the data? And what you see is that we have a lot of protocols and a lot of monitoring schemes that are relatively integrated in Europe, but we have very large gaps in space, in time, in accessibility, and also in taxonomic coverage. And for one class of EBVs, that is genetic composition, we virtually have nothing at this moment in terms of organized European efforts to monitor genetic diversity of species. So there are strong gaps, and again, you can check the results of this report in the review collection that EuropaBON has done. And we have also a report that focuses more on the bottlenecks and the flow of information. We also did a database of monitoring integration in Europe. You can check this database where we look at how different monitoring schemes are organized. There are already several databases of monitoring in Europe, but what we try to do is to understand how they are integrated and how they are brought together at the European level. And here is a comparison between two different approaches in freshwater monitoring and butterfly monitoring. The next work package looked at how we could improve the existing monitoring by designing monitoring around the idea of EBV workflows. Daniel is going to talk a bit more about this, but the idea is that you have to identify for each EBV what is the data collection and sampling, how do you go about data integration, and how do you go about the modeling. So these three components for each of the essential biodiversity variable. And then in another work package, we demonstrated how this could be done in support of the policies. Again, we are not just collecting data for the data. I love that, but it's not only about that. It's about serving important policies. And so we had these 5 showcases with examining how we could implement an EBV workflow to inform the reporting on the birds directive, or to inform or to use it better the data from the Water Framework Directive for biodiversity, or to better report on ecosystem extent for Habitats Directive, or how to look at a couple of bioeconomy relevant situations. For instance, how can you use the integration of remote sensing and models and in-situ data to do short-term forecasts of ecosystem services or of risks, that you could have kind of your daily biodiversity forecast, like you have your daily weather forecast that is useful for people. So what we're looking at showcases that are not only important for monitoring policy, but that bring value to society, that bring biodiversity with a value component for the common person. And we concluded with a proposal for a European Biodiversity Observation Coordination Center. We're going to present this today. Camille is going to present. We're going to have a nice panel on this and a couple of talks from colleagues from the European Commission, also on this idea of the European Biodiversity Observation Center. And I wanted to highlight here that this costs money. Operational EBOC, we just, right now, the parliamentary action, preparatory action on the EBOC, on the pilot EBOC, is at around 5 million euros. But we estimate that we would need 10 times that to do all the EBVs. The EBOC is going to do just 6 of the 84 essential biodiversity variables. But that only covers the European level integration and coordination. The on-the-ground monitoring would cost €500 million a year if you'd fully factor all the costs. But the benefits of this, we estimate also that there could be 1 order of magnitude greater. They are related to innovation, all the technologies that you need to do this, and development of technologies, to better access to natural capital, the biodiversity forecast, making biodiversity forecasts useful from industry, for instance, the operators of wind farms, the operators of other infrastructure that need information on biodiversity, to the common citizen, to improve environmental impact assessment, and to perform some major cost saving across redundant activities that we have. I wanted to highlight that we took open access very seriously in this project. And we have all our deliverables as an open view collection. So you can consult all of them, just go to the website, and all the aspects of this project were always done in a search for transparency, but also in a search to give access to people and scientists. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henrik, for summarizing this huge work in 20 minutes. We are probably, if there is a burning question, we can take this. Otherwise, we'll have 2 days of discussions, and we'll do this so you sort of introduce what is going to come. Then I think we'll go for coffee for half an hour. Thanks again for all our speakers for this morning and for the welcome words. Thank you. We'll be back sharp at 15:30, please. And coffee is upstairs in the mezzanine. So
Thanks, Ron. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope you enjoyed your coffee break. We're just going to get underway now with the afternoon session for the next 2 hours. We have a very packed schedule covering, as Enrique was mentioning this morning, we'll be going a bit more into depth now on the achievements of EuropaBON, and then following up with a little bit of feedback from the European Commission, and then we'll move into a panel discussion to wrap up the afternoon. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Daniel Kiesling. He is an associate professor of quantitative biodiversity at the Institute for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Dynamics at the University of Amsterdam, where he leads the biogeography and macroecology lab. And in EuropaBON, Daniel was leading efforts on the co-design of a new European monitoring system. So Daniel, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Ian, for introducing me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. So what I'm going to summarize is basically a lot of the work that's coming out of work package 4 of the co-design. And I've summarized this into recommendations for designing a modern and efficient European biodiversity observation network fit for multiple policies. So it's not reacting. No, now it's coming. So as Enrique pointed out this morning, our framework that we have been building on, a lot of the EuropaBON work is built on these essential biodiversity variables, these EBVs. And we have specifically identified for a European context a number of EBVs in different classes. You can distinguish species-focused EBVs. You can distinguish ecosystem-based EBVs in various EBV classes. But we also covered EBVs in different realms, from freshwater, marine to terrestrial, and also defined spatial resolution and temporal resolutions at which they are reported. The details of this list is available on GitHub. Now, one of the interesting things is that those EBVs that we developed are very closely linked to the EU policy framework that has been developing over the last 40 years in the EU. And most of those EBVs are specifically linked to the main EU legislation, which includes, for instance, Birds and Habitats Directive, Water Framework Directive, Marine Strategy Framework Directive. But we have also a number of EBVs that link to ecosystem services, for instance, Pollinators Initiative or the Forest Monitoring Regulation, and a range of EBVs that are linked to other EU policies that are relevant for biodiversity assessment and monitoring. And that is, for instance, the Common Fisheries Policy or the Common Agricultural Policy. Now, what I want to show in the next few minutes is 4 key aspects that have been coming out of the co-design work. This is about sampling networks, about monitoring methods, about workflows, and about the cost estimation. Now, for the sampling networks, one of the key aspects that we recommend for a spatial sampling design that we should start with an EU-wide stratified random sampling approach. You can think about taking all geographic units across Europe that can be grid cells, for instance, 2 by 2 kilometer in the terrestrial realm or 10 by 10 in the marine realm. Or you can use other spatial or geographic units such as catchments, lakes, river segments, for instance, for the freshwater. The example that is illustrated here is a grid-based approach where we put a grid across Europe. And then we need some intersection layers, stratification layers that define either environmental components, anthropogenic components, or policy layers that help us to sample different types of classes in a proportionally way to make a spatially, environmentally, and thematically representative sampling across Europe. And using then a number of those cells through a stratified random selection, you're ending up with a subset of those geographic units that you can then actually use for monitoring and sampling in the field. Now, if you are then at a local scale, you can range and you can deploy a range of monitoring techniques. Here is just an example, taking one of these grid cells and, for instance, deploying insect traps, transects, vegetation plots, soil samples, and a range of digital sensors. And what this allows is a co-monitoring, but also a co-sampling and a co-location of multiple EBVs at the same locations. So for instance, in this example, just let's say a conceptual example is you can sample species distributions of terrestrial insects with the traps. You can sample community abundance and taxonomic diversity of pollinators with automated monitoring traps and these pen traps. You can sample species abundance of butterflies with transects. You can sample with different sensors, species populations or species distributions and phenology of birds and mammals. You can sample community biomass, for instance, of cyanide microbes with soil samples and species distribution data of vegetation and terrestrial plants. Now, one of the examples or one of the questions that comes then is what are appropriate sample sizes that we should have across Europe? And this would require really detailed analysis of sample sizes, of power analysis, which we didn't have the capacity in our project to do. But here are a few examples, very heterogeneous examples that I wanted to show. So for instance, in the green above, some terrestrial examples of biodiversity monitoring. For instance, on the top, the European Vegetation Archive, vegetation plots that are sampled repeatedly, EMBAL and Lucas with some transect monitoring, for instance, or the birds and the butterflies. In the middle, you see examples. Here are the sample sizes, the actual land cover units that are sampled. For instance, it can be transects, it can be parcels, it can be landscape features, or specific photos that have been sampled in the Lucas and EMBAL monitoring. And below you see some examples from the Water Framework Directive monitoring. Here, the units are the actual water bodies, and that includes, in this case, lakes, rivers, transitional waters, coastal waters. You see that for a range of different taxa in the Water Framework Directive monitoring. Now, what is interesting, if you look at those examples, you can think about some minimum number of sampling units or selection of sites that can be around 10,000. Below this, often the trend estimation is very difficult. And you can think about an upper, let's say, an ideal sampling situation, which would be nice from a scientific point of view to be able to detect trends, which would be around 100,000 sampling sites. But you also see that only a few examples exist, even at a EU scale, for instance, for the land cover monitoring, which is typically also much simpler to sample than, for instance, biodiversity. Now, if we think about the European Biodiversity Observation Network, we should not start everything from scratch and instead build on existing monitoring schemes. And there are many existing schemes in Europe. But even the best examples that we have, here are illustrated, some of them have a lot of missing taxa, have a lot of spatial gaps, and have a lot of insufficient temporal frequency of the monitoring. So what you see here, for instance, in A is an example of butterfly monitoring across Europe, where the dark areas are those where a lot of transects are sampled, and the yellow areas are those where no transect is sampling in, for instance, the North or Eastern European countries. For the rivers and lakes are examples where the map shows the proportional representation of water bodies, rivers or lakes, for the best monitored groups. So this is, for instance, benthic invertebrates for the rivers or phytoplankton in lakes. And the yellow and the green areas show areas that are relatively underrepresented compared to the availability of the lakes or the rivers in those countries. And the marine shows a similar example, the number of sampling or monitoring schemes that provide data, and with yellowish or bluish, those areas that have relatively few sampling schemes, and those are typically away from the coast around the mainland Europe. Now, a little bit about what kind of monitoring methods are most relevant for the design that we have been thinking about. And this builds a lot on these EBVs that we have been mentioning and identifying. And if you think about those 84 EBVs, there's basically two main classes of monitoring techniques that can be distinguished. About 3/4 of the variables fall in the in situ observations, where we need in situ observation data to monitor the EBVs as a primary monitoring technique. And about 1/4 of those variables falls into remote sensing variables, around 20 of the EBVs. If you look into more detail, what is needed or what kind of monitoring techniques are behind, for the in situ, the large number, the large proportion of monitoring that is required for those EBVs is structured monitoring programs, which means you have standardized sampling and repeated sampling at the same sites. And that is, for instance, needed for species distributions of various taxa or community composition variables. But there's also a number of VBVs that can, to a large extent, depend on citizen science data, for instance, phenology variables, or variables that can depend heavily on DNA-based methods. And that is not only the genetic diversity, but also the community biomass, for instance, of soil microbes as examples. Now for the, let's say, remote sensing EBVs, the large amount of EBVs really depends on the satellite remote sensing. Think about the ecosystem distribution of particular habitats or algal blooms. But you also have a few variables that can predominantly depend on aerial remote sensing or on even using weather radar, for instance, about biomass flows of insects or birds. Now, what I was showing in the previous slide was the primary monitoring technique. So the most important monitoring technique for an EBV, but we also can supplement monitoring with a range of additional approaches. And this is basically what these graphs show, both for species-focused EBVs and for ecosystem EBVs. So if you think about additional sampling techniques that can complement for species-focused EBVs, for instance, the structured monitoring programs, the most important methods, and this is coming out of a workshop and a stakeholder engagement, citizen science approaches, DNA-based approaches, and digital sensors that can complement the structured in situ monitoring. On the other hand, for the ecosystem-focused variables, which are often depend on satellite remote sensing, we also need structured in situ monitoring, for instance, to get validation data, but also citizen science, genetic monitoring, and aerial remote sensing can complement those monitoring techniques for those EBVs. Another aspect is we need to bring together these very diverse types of data and integrate them and harmonize them. And this is basically what we need workflows for. Here's a simplified and generalized workflow description, which in black shows, let's say, an example of how most of the monitoring data are currently collected and integrated. So we have monitoring schemes, unstructured data. There's usually, or in many cases, some manual input. Often there's a report that is summarized and in another report. There are some national nodes and some EU integration nodes, for instance, for butterfly monitoring, the bird monitoring, or the Water Framework Directive. But a lot of these data, of the raw data, are not ending up as data at the European scale. Still, we can derive some trends, at least for some of those examples, like butterfly and bird monitoring, for instance. But what we need, or what we have identified also as need, is to include much more of these emerging tools and, for instance, advanced monitoring techniques for data collection, but then also as data entry that is standardized, a structured metadata description, so the metadata describing the sampling process and the data, more of automated data streams instead of manual input, and an automation in terms of, for instance, identification. Think about the emergence of all these AI models for species identification from digital media. At the EU scale or the national scale, we need much more of the EU-wide harmonization, and this requires more of those national and EU-wide integration nodes, but also things like data storage capacities, repositories, and more capacities for spatial modeling. And that can lead to these EBV data cubes that have been mentioned already in terms of different dimensions, spatial, temporal dimension, taxonomic dimensions that provide then these harmonized data, which allow us to spatially explicit map the data and the uncertainties at much finer resolution than it is currently possible. Now, we have been also asking some of the experts in our workflow, in our workshops, what are the major needs that you think across all these EBVs are needed for the further development? And for the data integration part, most important things that have been mentioned for the largest number of EBVs are multi-source data integration. So bringing together different types of data that have been heterogeneously collected or brought together and integrate them. But also an improved accessibility to those data, the metadata and data standards that need to be applied to such data, to standardize them, and an expansion of these integration nodes that I've been mentioning. On the modeling side, the largest need that has been mentioned by people involved in our workshops is the development of spatially explicit models, which often do not exist for many of those EBVs, and also a more effort on the indicator development and of allocating the driver information to the attribution of the drivers to those biodiversity data. Now, a final part that I want to show is a cost estimation that we've been doing across these 84 EBVs. And I want to mention that this is really has been an immense effort, mostly by one person who has been driving this over the whole course of the project with input from many, many people. This involves the costing for each individual EBV in our list at the EU level and the national level, and calculating the costs for all the data collection methods, usually a range of different methods that can be applied, for the workflows for data integration, for the coordination that is needed at the EU level and the national level, and separating those costs into materials and staff costs. For example, we have calculated for materials of data collection, traps, sensors, binoculars. We have for the staff, we calculate staff time for field setup, lab setup, training, for workflows, computer software, but also staff time for databasing, data integration, and for the coordination, things like organizing in terms of materials, data storage, servers, APIs, but also the staff time that is needed for the data management and the reporting. And all those costs were calculated over a 10-year period and separating the establishment costs that are needed at the beginning and annual maintenance cost for a 10-year period. So what I show in the following are a few slides on these cost estimations. And if you think about the total cost of monitoring for all EBVs over the 10-year period, we talk for a large network of a high number of sites, and that means here around 10% of the potential locations, which is, for instance, in terrestrial realm, 100,000 terrestrial sites, grid cells of 2 by 2 kilometer, or 100,000 river sections. We talk about 117 billion euro for a 10-year network for both the maintenance and establishment. Now, if you think about reducing the number of sites to a low site scenario, so this means around 1% of the sites are sampled, that would be for a 2 by 2 kilometer grid across Europe, around 10,000 sites or 10,000 river sections, for instance, we talk about 14.6 billion euro for the whole network over the whole 10-year period. Now, you can also organize this differently. The previous estimates that I've been just talking about assume that every EBV is sampled individually. We can also aggregate EBVs in sampling networks, which can reduce some of the costs because similar methods are applied. And this aggregation of EBVs into sampling networks, and I will show this in a moment how this looks like, will reduce, or to our cost estimation, will reduce the cost about 60% in a low site scenario to about 5.7 billion euro over this 10-year period. And this is the number that I'm now using in the following slides. And what you see here is just what I meant with the sampling networks. So we have defined for this cost estimation a range of sampling networks in the freshwater, marine, terrestrial, cross realm. These different sampling networks typically have some monitoring methods in common and therefore reduce, for instance, costs of traveling, or can reduce some of the costs of traveling and data collection. And in the lower and in the last column, you see that the amount of EBVs that have been included in those 18, in these different 18 sampling networks. So if we look at this cost of these 5.7 billion euro and split this further up in establishment costs and maintenance costs, we talk about around 500 million euro establishment costs for the actual biodiversity observation network across all the EU member states, and around 460 million euro annual costs. So in a 10-year period, you have to multiply this for the actual biodiversity network. At a European level, for the coordination activities, we estimated for the establishment 68 million euro, and for the annual maintenance of that network 56 million euro. And at a European level, the costs that are included include, for instance, what we have been talking about, the EBOC, data standardization, capacity building, modeling, and other aspects. So this is basically, in a nutshell, what I wanted to briefly show you about the design aspects that we have been discussing in EuropaBON. And in a nutshell, we basically recommend that a stratified random sampling across Europe with a co-location of monitoring activities and the incorporation of existing sites and a filling of monitoring gaps is the way we should adopt. The primary sampling of most of the EBVs will depend on structured in monitoring, in situ monitoring schemes, but also on satellite remote sensing, and that needs to be complemented with emerging monitoring techniques such as citizen science, DNA-based method, digital sensors, and area remote sensing. We need reproducible and standardized workflows for integrating these very diverse types of data and advanced modeling techniques to produce these wall-to-wall estimates or these spatially explicit data cubes. And to our estimation, we recommend at least an investment of about 5.7 billion euro for running and maintaining this minimum network of EBVs over a 10-year period. And this needs to be coordinated by a European Biodiversity Observation Coordination Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this whirlwind tour, but there has been a lot of work by the whole network. And as you said, you led we've organized several stakeholder workshops. So this is really culminating work from many people. Thank you very much. For the reason of time, we're moving on. And the next talk is going to be by Nestor Fernandez. Nestor Fernandez is a senior scientist at IDIF and University of Halle. And you're leading the production of data and metadata standards also in GeoBON for the EBV portal. And in EuropaBON, you've developed the showcases. Over to you.
I'll just mention while we're getting the slide up on the screen that we're also streaming this. So we have people also participating online, and just to let those folks know that it's being recorded, and you can put questions into the Q&A, and we'll be looking at those. Today's schedule is a little bit tight because we're wrapping up at 5:30. But tomorrow we'll have a little bit more time in the afternoon. We have a couple of hours planned for some discussion focused on the EBOC, and so we'll hopefully be able to take some of those questions into that discussion. So floor is yours, Nestor.
Thank you. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here presenting the work of these 4 years. What I'm going to present here is in reality the work of many different groups distributed in different research institutions and companies across Europe. So it's not only, it's not at all my own work only. So as most of you are aware, currently how the biodiversity data is flowing across the different compartments of what needs to be done for reporting is the following. Usually, the data is collected at the local level, regional level, national level, through different methods. It can be in situ monitoring, expert assessments. There are data legacies that are used for reporting, for example, under the Habitats Directive, or the Birds Directive, or the Water Framework Directive, etc. All that data goes to the European Environment Agency and goes to report on the different directives and so on, but it comes in an aggregated way. That means that the data, the underlying raw data, is hidden. It's not possible most of the times to reproduce everything that is behind. So there is one part of all the monitoring we are doing in Europe to report to the different policies, which is kind of obscure to most people. And then there is one part that is actually standardized. It is the part on where the different countries and different regions report to the European level. So this is something that EuropaBON is suggesting methods to address. So how can we push this line here, this vertical line that separates the hidden data, the underlying data, from the standards reporting up, so that we can have more reproducible monitoring data across Europe. And for demonstrating the entire road from collecting data up to the EBV cubes that Daniel have been presenting, we designed what is called the EuropaBON showcases. The showcases are examples, exercises that we did, trying to bring different data streams together and following a consistent workflow for developing EBB data cubes. Those are those spatial temporal data sets that then can be used for different purposes, including the assessments under the different directives or national reporting and so on. We try to cover the full range of EBB classes for the terrestrial and freshwater. So we selected species-focused EBBs, for example, those related to populations, such as file number distributions or mushroom and beetle pest phenology. But also in freshwater, for example, we tried to develop EBB cubes for lake macrophytes distributions. Then at the ecosystem level, we selected 7 more variables, and those include, for example, the distribution of habitats, of UNUS habitats, distributions of different variables of soil biota, migratory birds biomass, benthic invertebrate communities, and lake phytoplankton communities. So for all of them, the goal was, let's take the information that is out there or is being collected in networks or is available from other non-structured monitoring schemes and try to display how the entire workflow of EBBs can be produced. We did this together with many different experts and administrations, more than 100 stakeholders in totals. And we did this together through the entire process. So from starting with the design, so screening what are the feasible variables that could be produced at different scales, whether it is a national or European level. What kind of metrics, spatiotemporal resolution, extent would be feasible to achieve? What is the policy relevance of the different proposals for developing those showcases? And then what would be kind of the overarching workflows, so those steps, those pipelines that would allow to produce the EBB cubes. We included the NGOs, national agencies, the EU bodies, many research institutions, and the private sector in different design aspects, including, for example, what is the policy relevance of the variables that are being proposed, what data collection and data management aspects need to be advanced, or can we already harness, what are the workflows designed, and what are the uses and applications of the products that were planned. With that general framework, we also try to address many different flows of data currently existing at the European level and sometimes even at the global level. So, for example, how can we harness raw observations from bird counts or from plot vegetation communities, systematic sampling of freshwater systems, eDNA from soil samples, as for example in the Lucas monitoring system, opportunistic records that are distributed in GBIF and everybody can access, so it's much more easy to produce EBBs if they are suitable for our purposes, or even some kind of novel technologies such as radar detection for monitoring migrant birds. We also addressed in those workflows how the data is integrated or can be better integrated. For example, using existing networks. So there are very well-established networks, such as the European Breeding Bird Atlas surveys or the Pan-European Common Birds Monitoring Scheme. While in other cases, there are not networks behind collecting the data. So we need to start thinking about, okay, how can we mobilize the data and create networks around the collection and mobilization of the data in order to create essential biodiversity variables that are relevant. For example, in the case of habitats distributions, where excepting for the European Vegetation Archive and then a novel project on vegetation resampling in Europe, most of the data that could be available to generate those EBBs is not usually accessible. I'm not going to show all the showcases, but I would like to highlight some of the advances that we did in some of them. So each of the showcases actually addressed a particular topic, a particular challenge that we try to push forward. So for example, one of them is the farmland birds EBVs. So farmland birds are probably the best monitored aspect of biodiversity in Europe. All the different European countries generate indexes that are able to capture trends in farmland birds. We know that farmland birds are decreasing all over Europe, and also we know how important is monitoring those birds for different reasons. So for example, in the regulatory monitoring under the proposal of the Nature Restoration Law, farmland birds need to be monitored in order to address to assess the feasibility or the effectiveness of the restoration measures. So what we did here was to employ the data that is collected already in different monitoring schemes to generate models that can allow us to generate information on farmland bird change over time at any scale in Europe. So something that we learned here is that the trends in farmland birds can be monitored at 10 kilometers resolution, even annually in the future. And it is adequate for scalable indicators. Those are indicators that can provide information from the local level to the European level. A second showcase is one trying to map UNI's habitat extent. And here we found that the main challenge is the availability of plot data, but also lack of standardization in the definition of the habitat types. So that even if there are good methods already that can combine remote sensing information with plot vegetation data in order to develop predictive models of habitat distributions, at the moment we find that in order to be precise and have enough level of accuracy, this can be done mostly at the local or regional level, but the European level is still highly challenging. A third example is different showcases on ecosystem services. So using big data, either available from GBIF, for example, on mushroom fructifications, or data that is generated by technologies such as radar technologies, we developed the workflows to create or to produce forecast systems that allow you to react to some aspects, some dynamics of biodiversity that have some importance for the economy. So that is, for example, real-time monitoring the real-time community abundance of migratory birds, which is important, for example, for managing wind farms, or daily forecasts of mushrooms, which is a food resource or a recreational resource for millions of people in Europe. So with those EBVs, we can create almost near real-time forecasts right now using information that is publicly available. And finally, another group of variables in the showcases look at the future. So how can we use information that is being collected now, such as, for example, soil biodiversity sampling, for projecting the impacts of climate change and land use change on soil communities. And in this way, this is not only important for example, trying to predict what are going to be the effects of climate change, but also for identifying potential areas or critical areas for ecological restoration under climate change. Overall, we were able to push some different aspects of the workflows of EBVs across all of them. Obviously, we couldn't get up to the end in all of them. For example, still there are some challenges related to the availability, the public availability of the information, or there are some challenges related to how the information is shared or what kind of standards they use. But out of the showcases, 6 out of the 11 showcases were able to cover the entire EU, and 10 of them covered several different countries. 8 showcases matched the required resolution of the EBVs according to the survey of those 84 essential biodiversity variables that Enrique presented earlier today. 9 of them are already usable for monitoring dynamics in biodiversity or changes, and 7 of them already exploit data from existing monitoring initiatives. Okay, so the advantage of this kind of EBB cubes is that they are scalable in the sense that if we use those spatiotemporal data sets, we could eventually develop indicators in a consistent way at the local, regional, or European level. And that is useful for addressing, for example, changes in biodiversity trends, defining species and habitats ecological conditions, such as required under the Habitats Directive, develop surveillance systems, as I showed before, and develop projection scenarios. So this is the EBBs have been already produced. Some of them are being uploaded to the Essential Biodiversity Variables data portal. They will be publicly accessible, all of them, but they already give us also some important examples of how the next generation of biodiversity assessments can be done. For example, having a spatial explicit farmland birds indexes that can be used for, as I said before, for supporting the nature restoration law, or similar indexes for other species groups. Being able to produce high resolution habitat distribution and condition maps, assess the condition of habitats and species compared to baselines by, for example, comparing spatially the values of the EBBs in relation to some predefined baselines. Develop surveillance systems, as I explained before, for wildland collision risks, pests, ecosystem services, etc., and prioritize areas under restoration or monitor some of the aspects under the European restoration law. So finally, as I said before, many of those workflows have been pushed quite much to the limit. EBOC, this European Biodiversity Observation Coordination Center, is very much needed also in able to be able to unlock the collection, not only the collection of the data, but also open access to the data and then support the development of the models that then derive into EBBs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nestor, for that. Great overview of all the work going on in the showcases. And now the plan is that we're going to just dive a little bit deeper into one of the particular showcases, which was focusing on the Water Framework Directive. And that's going to be, that talk is going to be given by Anne Solheim. And Anne is a chief scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, NIFA. And her specializations include the ecological assessment of freshwaters for the Water Framework Directive, which is exactly what she'll be speaking about here on this particular showcase. So Anne, looks good. The floor is yours. I think you can advance the slides.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Do you hear me well? Yeah, good. So I will try to go into a little bit more depth to show some concrete examples of how far we have come in terms of freshwater monitoring in Europe. Oops. Sorry, this is going too fast. So first, some key questions. Where are the species actually occurring? Do we know enough about that? How are their geographical distributions affected by human disturbance? This is very important because we have heard Enrique present that we see that the biodiversity is declining. So how are really the human disturbance affect the single species distributions? Moreover, what is the current condition of freshwater communities? And has this been improving in line with the expectations of the Water Framework Directive, which said that it should be good status everywhere in Europe already in 2015? We already know that this has not happened, but how far have we got? And the last question, is the current monitoring sufficient to answer these questions? I also show you here examples of fauna and also phytoplankton, how it can look like in rivers and lakes when a water body is degraded, which is the orange part, versus the blue part at the bottom, where it's relatively pristine and has been restored back to good status. The freshwater EBVs that we have selected for this showcase are three. It's macrophyte species level distribution patterns, and it is two community condition variables related to benthic invertebrates in rivers and phytoplankton in lakes. So the goals has been to describe monitoring data sets and data flows related to these three EBVs, and also explore how to model macrophytes, species distribution, and also how to show and assess trends in the condition of communities. So first to the data and data flows for macrophyte species. We were able, after some struggle, to compile a data set of more than 2,000 lakes and about 100 different single species in Fennoscandian countries. These raw data, or the underlying data that we have gathered here, is based on the Water Framework Directive surveillance and or operational monitoring, as well as what the monitoring that was done before the Water Framework Directive came into place. These data are stored in national databases, but are unfortunately not reported to the EU level. Although there are some data reported to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF. We were also lucky to get abiotic covariates on nutrient concentrations, alkalinity, and climate available from these lakes. And access has been given by major research organizations in the Nordic countries, for which we are very grateful. So first we used these data to look at the actually observations, which is the left map that you can see here for a single species, which we have picked out as an example here. And with using the abiotic covariates put into a general linear model, we were able to assess the niche for this species and thereby to be able to extrapolate where it could potentially occur in addition to the sites where it actually does occur, which you see on the right map. We also wanted to use the data to see what human disturbances is doing to the distribution of this species. If we go from left to right in these four maps, you see the nutrient concentration is increasing from left to right. And you also see how the distribution is shrinking. It's becoming reduced to a very few sites at the very right end of this gradient. Now over to this community condition EBVs, which are based on ecological quality ratio values. This is then trying to, first of all, identify what is the reference condition currently. What is the natural state of these communities? And that is on the top of the scale of these three bars. And at the bottom, we have fully degraded or deteriorated sites with an EQR value of 0. These values have been based on absolute metrics for condition of communities, which is the left scale there in the different countries. And they have been converted to the middle bar, which are the EQR values. They have been intercalibrated among countries, so the data are comparable, in contrast to many of the data that are reported for the Habitats Directive, for which this process has not happened. So we're lucky to have this common implementation strategy in the Water Framework Directive, which have forced the countries to collaborate and agree on the deviation from the reference condition that would be compatible with good ecological status. The ETC working for EA is then doing the normalization to get to the right scale here, where we have equal bands between the status classes. These data sets are available in this link that you see on the top here from the EA-WISE system. And the data flow is then pictured here. You have already seen one of these maps before. The left side is one country, in this case, Sweden, just for an example, showing the different communities in the boxes that are monitored. And then EQR values are calculated and reported to EA, which is on the right map, together with all the other countries who monitor their data also. I won't make it. So here you can see the community condition EBVs based on the EQR values as spatial maps. These are also fully interactive. You can go into this link and play with it. There are filters. You can select the water categories and the different communities that you want to look at. And you can also choose the year on the top of these maps on the right side of each one of them. And we have just selected the year 2018 and 2020 here just to illustrate what these maps can show. And it shows the condition aggregated to class level for, in this case, benthic invertebrates in rivers in both the two maps. It also shows a very important thing. It shows the gaps. It shows that Germany, for example, has not reported almost anything to this data flow. And it shows that France reported a lot of data previously, but they stopped in 2014 for some reason that we do not understand. So these are the challenges also shown here. What we have spent a lot of time on is to look at consistent trends for time series that show the same water bodies throughout the last 6 years. And we have 3 groups of data. We have those that started in high status, which are on the blue and green part on the upper figures, and in the yellow part starting in moderate, and on the poor side starting in orange. And we see that for both the invertebrates on the left side as well as phytoplankton on the right side, the poor or bad water bodies seem to have improved, which we think is due to the implementation of measures done by policymakers to improve, to reduce the water pollution, which negatively has affected these water bodies. We also see in this plot here that the statistical trends are also, many more of them are improving with green color there or blue-green color compared to those that are deteriorating. Thus, this lower part of each of these 2 figures is really significant. They are indeed improving. Finally, we have also tried to use land use to try to link the EQR values to agricultural and urban land use. And you see this lower graph on the right side that the EQR values, which are plotted on the Y scale there, it is indeed increasing if the agriculture is, it's very good, it's very high. If agriculture is less than 34% of the total area of the water bodies, and if urban areas are less than 10%. On contrast, on the right side, where you see higher proportion of agriculture and urban areas negatively affect the EQR values. This is just an exploratory initial exercise that we have done as part of the topic center work for EEA. So in conclusions, we see that the species distribution of macrophytes in lakes can be predicted from models using environmental covariates to reflect their niche. And we can also look at how that niche is deteriorating with human pressure increasing. The negative side is that raw data is at species level is only accessible through national databases, and you need to get access to them in a proper way. And the same for the community condition EBVs, that the EQR data are indeed reported annually by many countries, and these are actually fully available, these data. And you have also seen interactive maps and consistent time series that is also fully available, as you can play with those using filters. But again, the spatial representativity should be improved by more monitoring, and the underlying data is only accessible through national data sets. So the final slide is whether the current monitoring is sufficient to show distribution condition and trends. And the answer is, well, partly it has been improving a lot with the Water Framework Directive coming on the stage in the year 2000. But the proportion is still too low to provide representative assessment of the species distribution, community condition, and trends in many countries, and also maybe for Europe as a whole. But we also have demonstrated how we can use data analysis and modeling to cover some of those gaps. So thank you for your attention. And this is where we want to go, and the right side is where we are, to be a bit provocative.
Thank you very much, Annelieke, for also for providing this really great overview for a case study with freshwater and what data can do. That we also see that regulations do play a role and they can actually improve this, but we also need the accounting to actually show that there is improvement, to learn from it, but also where there is an improvement, and that data flow already is not even where their data could be improved. Okay.
Sorry for going over.
No, thank you. So I think we're all in a marathon here. So but there is a lot of work from EuropaBON. And now we're looking forward to Camino Liquette's presentation on the ebook. So Camino has really been leading this work within EuropaBON, and she is a scientific officer in JRC's. Okay, she's a leading officer in JRC's Nature Conservation and Observation Unit, and working in the European Commission on Knowledge a Center for Biodiversity. And there, Camino, you lead the European dimension, and you have been really at the helm of developing the TRR with all of us and with many stakeholders online and also within Europe. So thanks for presenting now. Okay, we look forward to this.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity of having this presentation today. So yes, I'm Camino Liquette. I'm working on the European Commission on the Knowledge Center for Biodiversity, but today I'm a EuropaBON partner. So I'm gonna show you this last mile of effort that we went through. So let's start with the context. We have heard in the previous presentations that there are lots of challenges. Despite advances on biodiversity monitoring that Anne, for instance, showed some minutes ago, on the recent years, data is still scattered and hard to use in Europe. So there are plenty of organizations, institutional and not institutional, with different objectives, different governance, different mechanisms, and different data infrastructures collecting data. So this fragmentation still exists. The results from previous work packages within EuropaBON have concluded that the main bottlenecks for data monitoring, for biodiversity monitoring at the moment are two across all realms and all the 84 EBBs shown. And they are accessibility to those data sets, so data access, and integration of data sets. Many times the data is collected, but the step to integrate and make it interoperable is still missing. Then there were many other work packages mentioned by Enrique before that analyzed the monitoring scheme, a plethora of monitoring schemes across Europe. And from that analysis, we saw that only half of them have only partial automation of the data flows and partial harmonization of those. So even of those monitoring schemes that exist, still there is a lot to do on the digitalization of them. And also half of the sampling efforts of the monitoring schemes analyzed are not sufficient to actually inform about the EBBs list that the EuropaBON proposed. And this leads us to the next issue, which is that we need to expand the sampling. We need much more coverage. Europe still lacks the data, the appropriate data to manage biodiversity. We are still not there to fit the models that, for instance, reply to our impact assessment for new policies. And some examples also mentioned by Enrique before, when we analyze the characteristics of the monitoring schemes across Europe, and I insist it was hundreds and hundreds of monitoring schemes, we saw that 100%, so all the monitoring schemes that inform EBBs related to genetic data at species level, they were not appropriate. So there were some characteristics, either they are inconsistent or not maintained, lack coverage. These percentage are 30%, for instance, for EBBs related to species traits, 48% for species population, and a bit more than 50% for ecosystem structure. So this is a situation that we see all around. And when we asked in the different workshops and meetings we have had with the stakeholders, what is that you need for your work? Number one demand is the harmonized EU indicators, which are mostly lacking, and secondarily access to data. So in this context, we started this work 2 years ago. I want to emphasize here that this has been an enormous collective effort. We started screening all possibilities, what can be the mandate, the legal mandate of an EBOC, what can be the financial instruments, what can be the governance model, all possibilities were screened. And then little by little, workshop and meeting after meeting, consultation after consultation, we were narrowing down, and actually a lot of opinions agreed in the options that we show on the proposal that you can see printed upstairs or in the links there. So this consultation, I will not enter into the details. There were many steps and many people replying. Let me jump to the last bullet point here, because I want to highlight the contribution, of course, not only from the consortium, because we were into the work, but also other externals, Biodiversa Plus and GVIF. They really were so much engaged into this work that they become co-authors with us of this proposal. And notably the European Environmental Agency, they follow us from the very beginning, giving us all the information needed to know the present context and how to better improve the situation, to the extent that we propose the EA to have a central role and maybe even a hosting role on this EBOC. And last but not least, all the plethora of experts that have replied to our consultations from NGOs, research projects and infrastructures, networks, associations of experts, and notably the European Commission, our colleagues that were also targeted with an other group on biodiversity monitoring and consulted over the last 2 years. So what is the vision? What do we propose with this EBOC? The EBOC should help the EU to coordinate and streamline exactly what Daniel presented. This European Biodiversity Observation Network, that is the scope. This is a system of observations, data simulation methods, models, knowledge, and also capacity building. This is very much demanded to deliver up-to-date information on a practical set of EBBs that is tailored to support policy decisions. That's the vision. And also from the policy side, what we want the EBOC is to deepen the perspective that we have nowadays from assessments, from the interpretation, down to information and data. We can no longer rely on judgment, experts' judgment or qualitative assessments. We need robust data behind those kind of assessments, also to ensure coherence across the sector and efficiency in the data collection, as Daniel showed before. There are some key principles that we actually propose all across the report that you can read. This EBOC should be permanent, should be institutionalized, should be notably based on national biodiversity monitoring hubs, who are the essence, have the mandate to collect this data, and should engage also with all the knowledge holders, and this variety of knowledge holders, from researchers to NGOs and non-governmental organizations, and also data infrastructure, for instance. Should build on existing schemes. We are not reinventing the wheel. We have to mobilize the networks and infrastructures that are already in place, and should have a governance that is hybrid, invite people to collaborate, and also is focused on the policy making. This is just a review. The objective of the EBOC is a review of the previous presentations. The objective of EBOC is to fill this workflow. You have seen it several times, from the data collection, data integration, modeling, then we can build really comparable information in the EBB cubes, and finally derive indicators and evidence for policymakers. We need to fill this chain for each single EBBs. Only when we focus on one EBB, we will be able to identify what are the needs. And in each EBB, it will be placed in a different place. For instance, the two key aspects are to unlock the hidden potential of the existing data sets. So the second part here, that's the presentation of Anne before, for instance, and also the first step here, plug the holes, so fill the gaps in biodiversity monitoring programs. And how we can do it, we screen like 1,000 of tasks that were demanded by stakeholders, really far too many, and we had to prioritize what is urgent and what is relevant. And these are the few tasks that we finally selected as most urgent and relevant. And I'm not going to read across all of this, but let me just give an overview. There is a set of functions that is on coordination and support. The most demanded activity actually is help member states and institutions to coordinate their activities. It is the promotion of the national biodiversity monitoring hubs that Biodiversa Plus, GBIF, and others are actually promoting together with us, but it's also about getting into the same table, engage these external knowledge holders. We have to forge strategic collaborations with the knowledge holders that are out there to integrate all these sources of data. In terms of capacity building, again, this was probably the second most demanded task by all stakeholders to help with training, tools, and knowledge. The topic to start with is data exchange and standardization. If we want to fill this workflow, that is where we should start with data exchange and standardization. But right after, we have to jump to many other topics: data collection, taxonomy, citizen science have to help the volunteers and the coordinators, funding sources, where to find them. So we have to work on a lot of other topics in the near future. The second set of functions is actually the core of the EBOC. It's about data. And it starts with the data mobilization, integration, and harmonization. For doing so, we need to identify datasets, transform them, and publish them. Then about open data, there is a whole discussion, and there are many technical capabilities to actually keep sensitive information for the data owners and still use them, like bringing the algorithms to the data and not the other way around. And for doing all these activities, of course, we need a data infrastructure and a plethora of tools that are using data metadata standards. But in many cases, I think it was Nestor this case that showed many cases do not have such infrastructures, but many EBBs do. So again, here we have to bring together the expertise of, for instance, I just list here some examples. The Global Biodiversity Information Facility that we promote very much in our proposal, but OBIS is relevant for the ocean, global data, EMONET for the European is the hub for the European data sets. EASIN is really the reference database for invasive alien species, and it's already accessible and standardized and serving policy needs. And of course, the data sets, all the servers and the data flows that go into the European Environment Agency. Apart from developing data access and sharing policies and promoting those, we also have to focus on another aspect, which is to improve these monitoring activities. And we have the idea that the EBOC should become a reference point for knowing what are the existing monitoring protocols, identify together with the thematic experts, with the experts on each EBB, identify the best methods and guidelines, what is the cost-efficient sampling in each of the EBBs or topics, the co-monitoring that Daniel was mentioning, and when and how to use the novel technologies to get harmonized data. And the last set of functions is about the analysis and support for stakeholders. This is, I have to insist, it's not for research, but for policy and managers. So develop the models, the statistical analysis, the gap analysis, the analysis and visualization that serve these ultimate needs of managing and policy making. Identify in the gaps, what are the gaps that are actually obscuring the assessment, are changing the conclusions of our assessments. And last but not least at all, ensure that in all these steps, we follow the FAIR principles, that data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And justice is given to the data owners. They are recognized, and transparency is also shown for the methods. And this has to be done with each EBB community. And this is what we see, what we propose as the governance structure. We want a hybrid approach. The hybrid approach is both centralized and decentralized. The centralized system is because we propose a secretariat that is taking the lead on these tasks that I said before, hosted or embedded in an EU institution, in an agency or a body that we propose nowadays to be the European Environment Agency, that is linked to the policy making, and of course closely linked to the EU institutions and agencies at large. But then the rest of the work is a decentralized network, very much based on these national biodiversity monitoring hubs to have this interconnection, and actually they mirror the task of the EBOC at the national level. And also mobilizing all these other actors that are actually maybe not part of the discussions. These transnational, international, let's say, supranational NGOs and platforms, the people who coordinate monitoring schemes and to get the data gathered at different levels. And everything should be based on the thematic hubs that are mentioning over and over again. Each EBB has a community, several groups of experts that are really the experts in the field and in the remote sense data. Internally speaking, the structure of the EBOC can be a general secretariat with operational and tactical roles hosted by an institution. And then the strategic vision, the strategic roles are given by a General Assembly. In the General Assembly, both the national and EU institutions should sit, but they should be closely followed by a technical and a stakeholder advisory board with all the members that participate in the EBOC. And finally, the Secretariat should be supported by a data governance and ethical committee. That's crucial when you deal with data from many stakeholders, and by all the specialists and implementers that are there in the thematic hubs, but that's EBB per EBB. And finally, about the cost, you have heard already several estimations of the cost. We insist EBOC is an investment, it's a notable investment in Europe's environment, but really the long-term benefits outweigh the costs. And let me go straight away to the cost of the entire list of EBBs proposed by EuropaBON. For that decade that Daniel was mentioning, if we look at the cost, our estimations for all the activities, all the material, or all the staff, only for coordination is around €500 million for that decade. But if you see the cost of the actual observation network, what Daniel was presenting was one order of magnitude higher. So it's between the the minimum sampling and the maximum sampling, between 6 and 40 billion euros. And the benefits are again one order of magnitude higher. This work, the work that will show up, that number is still not published. So this is preliminary, but we are reaching nearly 300 billion euros of benefits. Assuming that the EBOC provides a high quality, interoperable and validated data. This could bring savings for businesses, for instance, all the new rules for businesses, for firms to comply with the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure, but also with existing environmental impact assessment. So having access and robustness on these data sets can really save a lot of money. Also to build trust and to make quicker the investment on green finance instruments. It will save a lot of time on research activities, but also on modeling. It will bring the models up to another level. And as Enrique was mentioning, improving the models' accuracy will also improve our policies through impact assessments, just as an example. This is my last step. We have heard here and there that the next steps for the Commission is to implement an EBOC pilot funded by the European Parliament. We are looking forward, EuropaBON is closing now, but we are looking forward for what it brings. And we just want to highlight that for it to succeed, it needs a clear mission, a niche in the EU institutions or policies, steady funding, of course, and broad collaborations. And this brings me to all the audience here and beyond. We need everybody. We need everybody on board. I mean, regardless of who leads the EBOC on its implementation, the pilot or the permanent, we need absolutely all networks and the involvement of all the experts from authorities, research, NGOs, and so on to make it really a success. That's all. Thank you very much.
Very much, Camino. Thank you. Yeah. So we're, tomorrow afternoon, looking forward to that. We're going to have a session where we then really get into depth and discuss. And actually the entire day tomorrow is more or less focused to really have discussions around the EBOC. So now it's my pleasure to welcome two colleagues to the podium from the Commission for some feedback. I believe we're first going to begin with Pier Luigi Londero. Piero is the head of the data governance unit in the Director General for Agriculture and Rural Development, DG Agri, at the European Commission, responsible for data governance, data integration and management and digitalization, and is an agricultural economist by training and was involved in many of the main reforms at the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, over the last 25 years. So Pier Luigi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for inviting me, inviting DG Agri in these times of polarization. It's good to hear different voices. And congratulations for the researchers for the good work. As it was said, I come from the data governance unit. It's a recent creation. There is a need to make sense of the data we have, to use it best. And also because the data that we have in agriculture, of course, are of interest of a broader community. So I was asked to provide a feedback of what I heard today, but of course I cannot resist to share with you something I hear in the corridors in DG Agri, kind of witnessing of also a change in mindset of many colleagues. So I will start with a kind of a couple of words about how far agriculture and biodiversity are felt and the impact of agriculture on biodiversity as what is concerned. And then I'll delve in the data governance issues, which I saw coming up, and I could share some information that I think could be useful. So on the first point, on the importance of biodiversity monitoring for DG Agri, for agriculture as a human activity to produce food, I see, of course, beyond the common agricultural policy of the last 60 years, and let's say more on a longer scale, at the time 12,000 years ago, when humans decided to go into agriculture, this created, in fact, the basis for voluntary selection of the varieties that are more productive to feed the people. And the same with animals. And we end up today with an agriculture which concentrates on few species with all the impacts it has. There is also, I think, from that time, and the Green Revolution continued the same mantra, is that species are in competition all the time. And therefore, you need to weed, you need to kill the pests, otherwise your selected species cannot survive. You cannot produce food, you cannot feed the population. Thanks God, this is slowly changing. And science, I think, has played a major role. The science of 30 years ago was the science of competition, probably as well. And the science of today shows that cooperation, you see it in nature, and it brings so many benefits. In fact, it's an understanding of life that we didn't have and that we need to build our agriculture upon. Because you can value the impact of agriculture on biodiversity. At the same time, I see a growing sense of understanding how much the biodiversity in return is important for the resilience of agriculture, for the robustness, to have, of course, we've been working for many years with indicators. You take the easy one, which are not easy at all. The bird index, it seems easy, but to build and still better can be done. So the pollinators, so all the sentinel species that tells you that there is a disequilibrium in the ecosystem. There is a growing attention to the soil and its function as the living soil. I still see bias for animals than plants. We are humans, of course, we have a bias inbuilt, but I think the research and the funding which goes to research privileges the animals than the plants. And so this idea that I think it's starting to be, let's say, shared as mainstream, that as we move into a world which is more full of instability and fluctuations, it's exactly a world where you need living biodiversity to make sure that your system is robust. And last thing of introduction is just the role of policies. The role that it can have on that. So we, of course, evaluate our work of the policy work. Did the policy achieve the objective? Were there unintended consequences? And of course, if you don't find the data, you cannot assess the impact. So for that, it's very important to have a good biodiversity monitoring to be able to measure the extent of the damage or the extent of the situation so you can plan to improve it. We have also external evaluators. The Court of Auditors is one of our favorite. They are always very critical. And in 2020, they've done a biodiversity in farmland, which was quite a harsh report. In 2022, I was all object of an audit on the big data in DG Agri. And basically they ended up focusing on the data gaps, and biodiversity was one of the main data gaps. At the same time, I have to say that when we look at the impact assessment, when we do the new policies, we need to look at all the various aspects. And of course, it's always the weak point. We don't have the data, and the models are not performing well, and therefore we cannot assess what would be the impact of the policy on biodiversity, for example, and other environmental dimensions. At the same time, I've been looking at policies across the world. Different policies have different impacts. No policies also has a major impact. When you leave it to the pure market forces, you can go very far into the the greed of humans into big damages. So policies can be and should be a tool for framing and for trying to improve the situation. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I would like to say a couple of words about what I heard about the data landscape. In fact, it's a fantastic mapping that you've done in this research project to start with. As we have many projects in the Commission as well, we try to make the data talk between different domains, and we struggle, like you, with the different geographical aggregations. And we have data parcel level, farm level, LRU, NUTS2, etc. So different data is locked in different places. We have a policy, the Common Agriculture Policy is shared management policies. We share it with the member states. And all the data which goes into the payments, which is very rich and very detailed at parcel level, it's owned by the member states, which then decline it at the regional level. So we have 40 different systems. And so how to bring them back, this information, make it available to everybody in a usable way, and not as is, but in a way that can be shared. I'll say a couple of words about some parallel, let's say, work which could benefit this community. One is so in the research for agriculture, we have a lot of efforts also in data collection or data interaction between different places and actors. We also have a new way of doing research these days, which is the partnership with the member states. So the research partnership, there is one which has been launched recently. It's called Agriculture of Data. And basically with 100 million from the Commission and 200 million from the member state, we create a pool where the consortium set the research agenda and then calls will be issued. That's very interesting because it covers the data gaps that we have in agriculture, climate and environment. I would like to say in the last minute a word about interoperability. It's been mentioned very many times. I hope you know what FAIR means. It is an imperative. We are underusing the data. The data most of the time is collected for one purpose only, and it could be very useful for many other purposes. So we are trying to unlock this with a project that we are trying to build with a joint research center, including D6. And on interoperability, we have money from the Digital Europe program. So you see, it's even the Digital Europe program, which comes to us and tell us, come on, make your data interoperable so that more can use it. And the final word is about when I saw these ecosystems, I hear also, well, I don't hear it, but I understand it. There is a lot of work going on in DG Environment, in DG Agri, on building the future data spaces. The data space is the, let's say, an IT, let's say, infrastructure and a rule about the sharing of the data. So far it's in the inception. There are deployment actions starting next year. It's a way to make sure that more data is shared and is available. There is a lot there from private operators. So there is a private dimension, but it's, we are, the European Commission, we are interested to put in the data we have and to be able to take out the data we need. So good luck with the continuation of this interesting and ambitious project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pierluigi Londero, for making the links to agriculture, also the interoperability, and also, for example, how we could share data and how this, how the biodiversity data might help also agriculture to assess their own goals. So I think that's really important to work across sectors, and that's why it's my pleasure to introduce Owen McIde as Deputy Head of, so moving to the marine realm. So Owen McIde as Deputy Head of the unit in the Director General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries at the European Commission, in the unit responsible for the coordination and development of the common fisheries policies and the EU fisheries funds. You come from a scientific background, and you have worked in a range of files for DG Mare and JRC for the last 15 years. Okay, thank you. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invite to speak. It's nice, actually, that I speak after Pierluigi because I think we have very similar outlook on the need for biodiversity data, but I'm going to focus on the marine and maritime side, which is, I think, from what I've seen today, is more difficult than the terrestrial environment to get information on. So first of all, let me congratulate all involved for the really impressive work over the last 3 years. I'm going to talk, as I said, from our perspective, which is on fisheries and oceans policy. So marine biodiversity protection, monitoring and preservation is really at the core of our activities as the Commission service responsible for the management and development of the common fisheries policy. In terms of our own experience of biodiversity monitoring, we have the Fisheries Data Collection Framework, which consists of national data programs and analysis. And we also indirectly monitor on a wider scale, so not just for fisheries, through the European Maritime Observation Data Network, which is better known as EMODNet. I've seen a couple of references to that today. And we're also developing an ocean observation initiative. And I know that many of the participants here today are involved in that. At a higher or even wider level than that, there's also Mission Ocean and the European Digital Twin of the Ocean, which requires a very high volume of quality marine biological observations, as well as many other types of data, ultimately to deliver an understanding of what is their life underwater more broadly. For DG Mare, when it comes to taking decisions on managing fisheries and protecting the marine environment, a sound knowledge base is fundamental to success. And this requires systematic data collection, scientific monitoring and analysis using robust methodologies. So for us, this is something that has been built up over a period of many, many years, decades even, under the Common Fisheries Policy. And it requires a constant effort to ensure that the data are adequate and accurate to build a picture, to model and to support resource management decisions. So I fully appreciate the scale of what's being undertaken here. More generally, from our experience, we see that despite all of the work on developing tools and infrastructures for collecting and monitoring data, the reality is that many of these initiatives often remain on an individual basis and leave a kind of a fragmented landscape. So coordinating this at a European level makes a lot of sense, but we know that it's a very complex and challenging and of course a very useful task. We need this to realize improved coordination and a wider coverage on observations on biodiversity. So from our perspective in fisheries and maritime, just to give you an idea of where this data would come in use, in DG Mare, we manage the Common Fisheries Policy and the associated Marine Action Plan. We have the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, and then we have other topics related, such as the development of offshore energy. We have aquaculture, and we also support our colleagues in DG Environment with the implementation of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So many different areas where this data would come in use. And we understand that the work planned through this coordination center is very ambitious, and it must be ambitious to be successful. We're talking about bringing together a lot of very, very diverse data from different communities, different topics over a very wide area. Two important considerations I want to make just before we close, and I think, well, let me say them first. We need to ensure that all of the relevant and existing initiatives, such as EMODNet and the Digital Twin of the Ocean, which I referred to, are properly integrated without duplicating that effort or interrupting what already works well. And the second, I think, is more relevant in the marine domain because of the type of data that we're talking about. We need to be very sure that we factor in confidentiality of the data and that that's respected where it's an issue. Because it can be an issue with certain observations from our experience, maybe not in terms of some of the examples that we saw this morning where you had traps and sampling. Those kind of things are much more difficult in the marine environment, and often we rely on professional or data that is owned by individuals. So I want to reassure you that DG Mare and the Commission is really on board with this work, and we're willing to participate in the development of the Biodiversity Ocean Coordination Center. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for your support, and I hope both of you are going to be around also for the reception so that people can talk to you individually. We are now going to have a panel discussion where obviously also questions can be raised by the audience, also to the speakers. So thank you for this wonderful afternoon. We would like to welcome the speakers for the panel session on the stage.
That's Tim Hirsch from GBIF, please, and Jan-Erik Pettersen from the EEA, Richard Gregory, thank you, from Royal Society for Protection of Birds, and Petri Vihabara from Biodiversity Plus. Great. So I'll just quickly introduce everybody here that we have on the panel before I hand it over back over to Aletta. So I'll start with Tim. Tim Hirsch is the Deputy Director and Head of Participation of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, for more than 10 years. And in his present role, Tim leads the team engaging private sector and development actors in sharing biodiversity data through GBIF, and also a member of our advisory board on EuropaBON. Then I will introduce Petri Vihervaara. Here, on my left, Petri is a research professor of the Finnish Environmental at the Finnish Environmental Institute and leads the European Biodiversity Partnerships, otherwise known as Biodiversa's effort to establish a transnational network of national biodiversity and subnational biodiversity monitoring schemes. And we've had a very close relationship with Biodiversa Plus together with EuropaBON and over the last 3 years, which is very much appreciated. Then I would like to introduce Richard Gregory here on my far right, who is an honorary professor at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, CH, in the UK, and head of monitoring at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and also a member of the EuropaBON Advisory Board. And finally, Jan Erik Pedersen to my left, who is an ecosystems and accounting expert at the EEA, and he currently focuses on helping to develop approaches to ecosystem accounting at the EU and global level, and also has been an advisory board member of EuropaBON. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll start with Jan Erik from the European Environment Agency. As you heard from Camino, the EEA is supposed to have a central role and also lead this. So where do you think that the EBOC can provide opportunities as well as maybe challenges for the EEA, and how will this enhance the work which the EEA is doing already?
Well, thank you very much for the involvement of the EEA in the entire work of EuropaBON, and thanks very much for all the hard work and great outcomes, first of all. And secondly, we would love to have to make a major contribution to future biodiversity monitoring and helping to implement a biodiversity observation center. Just as we would love to help implement a nature restoration law. Just our funding is decided by the European Parliament and the member states on the basis of a proposal from the Commission. We can't decide it ourselves. So that's the official answer. But I think after all this effort, given all the recognition that biodiversity gets also in the policy scene, it's time to take stock and look a bit forward. And we have really various positive factors. One is the recognition that biodiversity gets. We speak of a biodiversity crisis. We have also a lot of progress in technology in terms of biodiversity observation, in terms of data integration, even in terms of satellites. They're not my favorite tool, but still they're useful. And we have an excellent scientific proposal how to implement biodiversity monitoring in Europe on the basis of EuropaBON. So this, I think, is a very good starting point. But we also have no regular funding for biodiversity monitoring at EU level. And we have competition for resources for monitoring different social and environmental phenomena. So I think we need to focus more on the issue of how important biodiversity data is to making our society fit for the future. And Camino spoke to it, others spoke to it. I mean, data is a resource. Data is a resource in the digital sector and the digital economy that is coming. Data is a resource. So we have different resources for transition to the renewable energy that we need, lithium, other rare metals. If we want to have really a successful green transition that is a bioeconomy that supports nature rather than just exploits nature, we need to see biodiversity data as a resource in that transition. as also mentioned in the EuropaBON presentation. So I think that's a theme we just need to develop further and hopefully bring into the planning for future budgets of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Jan-Erik. I'll give the floor now to Petri for perhaps just a few brief words on the, I mean, as I mentioned, we had a very good relationship between Biodiversa Plus and EuropaBON, and perhaps you'd just like to comment a little bit on that, on going forward, how Biodiversa Plus could perhaps pick up some of this joint work that we've developed together and take it forward.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thanks also for the whole EuropaBON consortium for good collaboration over these past years. So Biodiversa Plus is a little bit longer initiative. We will continue work until end of 2028. And we are really like a new network in this big picture. So we are bringing together ministries of environment and environmental protection agencies, really this national, subnational scale of the steering and coordinating and the funding biodiversity networks. And we have very much enjoyed this collaboration, that how we can really find synergies between these two scales, EU scale coordination and then this national subnational scale. So among our Biodiversa Plus partners, it has been really like eye-opening period of these 2-3 years. I think that our partners has also realized what is the potential of this kind of European collaboration, and there's increasing interest towards this kind of establishment of the collaboration and working together with the key players, and also mentioning GPIF and EA as well as a really key organizations and institutions in this network. So we are really much looking forward. We have our colleagues, Aino Lipsonen and Guillaume there on the back in the middle. So they are our strong powers of the Biodiversa task leaders as well. And Aino especially is leading this initiative to bring together this kind of like a governance aspects of the how to support and establish this national biodiversity monitoring governance, national biodiversity coordination centers as a counterparts of the EBOC. And that's really something what is emerging. It's an evolving process, and we don't have solutions yet, but we have a lot of initiative and motivation to work together and continue with this new EBOC pilot when it starts over the next 2 years and then towards 28. And hopefully it continues that. So we think that this is not just like this period now until 28. We really see like a long future for the next decade, that this is something that we need to continue even after the Biodiversa Plus is over. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Petri. And we're taking questions from the audience. We have a little ball to throw around. So please let us know if you have questions, but we're continuing the round. First of all, we first have the European institutions like EA. Then we have the member states who are the strong pillars for the EBOC. But another strong pillar is obviously the NGOs and the naturalist societies, and therefore the question goes to Richard Gregory. The birds obviously have been organized for a long time across Europe, and that is also mirrored in that we have farm and bird indices who can actually say something about our biodiversity. Another strong network is for butterflies. We're going to hear about this tomorrow, and we're going to go more into the other networks tomorrow as well. My question to you is, so what do you see as a role of big NGOs and naturalist societies to be another pillar of EBOC?
I think in a general sense, as we've seen from the project, the potential of that a kind of a blended sort of army of monitoring individuals and capabilities and institutions, it must be the way to go forward, and that's sort of the vision we now have for EBOC. So I think the ENGOs, the way they can work alongside the institutions and with the research institutions collectively to sort of promote citizen science as a major form of data collection that is respected alongside professional data collection, alongside remote sensing and scientists working with the citizen scientists and you know, experts to coordinate. I think that whole sort of blended approach is what we see in the vision. And I suppose although people have said one of the characteristics of biodiversity monitoring across Europe, when we look at it, is that we have that fragmentation, yet the actual motivation and the vision of so many of those partners, it is very common. You know, we all have very similar vision. So I think that's the great sort of a real hope that we see for the project, and you know, the products of the project have really brought that together in a really, you know, crystallized what that might look like in the vision of the epoch, which I think is really exciting. So I hope we can all be a part of it, and the ENGOs be a real part of that too. You know, working hand in hand with all the other components.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for that. Yeah, just a quick final word then over to you, Tim. And we've been collaborating very closely with you and GBIF and colleagues, and we greatly appreciate that within EuropaBON. I just wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit on, especially as you're following closely the project, your thoughts about how GBIF in the next few years could really perhaps build a little bit and contribute to and pick up some of the ideas being put forward by EuropaBON.
Yes, thank you very much, Ian. And maybe I'll just preface my remarks by saying that I think, in a sense, you could also be asking the same question with regard to OBIS on the marine side. We just heard a very informative talk about the marine angle on this. I think it's important to recognise that GBIF works in very close partnership with OBIS, the Ocean Biodiversity Information Service, and in fact there'll be an announcement tomorrow which will inform you about the next stage of that collaboration, just as a preview. Having said that, I think that in many ways the role of GBIF and OBIS collectively on this, I think, has been made very apparent in the succession of presentations we had today, because right through it we heard about the challenges of integration and harmonization, and actually getting around to sharing the raw data in a meaningful way rather than just being willing to share it. Many, not all, but many of the tools and the solutions that can help in that process are already there in terms of the infrastructures that GBIF and OBIS operate, in terms of the data standards, in terms of the formatting and the sharing protocols, which if used and if employed in a way that makes appropriate use of the technology that's available, can go a long way towards that integration. Now, it won't deal with all classes of EBVs, it won't deal with absolutely all the needs, but it can help in a lot of this integration. It's great to see in the vision document and the TORs that there is a section around data mobilization and harmonization that looks at the expertise that, for example, exists within the national nodes of GBIF in many, but certainly not all, but in many of the member states that can help with that. I think that there is also, we're looking here in terms of standards at an evolving landscape, which we'll hear a little bit more about tomorrow from our director, Joe Miller, in terms of the review of the data model employed by GBIF up until now, which in developments that are now very much at quite an advanced stage of discussion, will enable GBIF to be able to handle a much richer variety of data. For example, the context behind monitoring, being able to handle absences and abundances in a much more meaningful way, which will, I think, expand the usefulness of what GBIF can do in this space. I would just sort of finish with one challenge that we face, GBIF as a global infrastructure, is that operating at the European level is not that straightforward for us, because we're a global infrastructure, we have a global mandate, and our members are essentially governments, national member states in the context of Europe. It's also great to see within that section of the blueprint for the EBOC that there is a need for some way of GBIF operating more effectively at the European level. Now, exactly how we do this, I think is a matter for discussion. We've been having discussions with the Commission. We, of course, are discussing ideas within our own nodes community within Europe as to how GBIF can really contribute to this coordination within the governance structure of an EBOC, but still respect our own mandate to be a global organization. I think these are questions that are certainly have solutions, and I think it's an exciting prompt in a sense for GBIF to work out ways in which we can really serve European data needs.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So what you're actually, I think what we're describing here, what we're hearing here is really a data mesh approach. So where there is responsibilities from different partners who obviously have different strengths and go forward. I'm looking to the audience. So if you have some questions or if you have some comments, please do raise your hand. So Ian and I will try to monitor this. Maybe the question to the floor here, first of all, was the panel. What do you think are the next steps and how should EBOC go now forward in the first pilot phase? What would be your suggestions? What would be your steer? Because you have been advising us also as EuropaBON, and now it's sort of the next level. We have this, we have the terms of reference. Obviously, we have to wait for the European election before it can start. But what will be the next steps in order to get this rolling within the network of the different actors who are already active playing there? So you.
I mean, an obvious point would just be to say to be, as the project has done brilliantly so far, is to be inclusive, to include, you know, all of the different aspects and the players across Europe, as the project has done, such that everybody is sort of in the tent, on the train, in a destination, you know, to improve biodiversity and going forward. So I think that would be a plea to bring on board all of the key players and be very careful not to exclude.
And maybe this was also apparent from Camino's slide about the governance, which is already meant as a network, so that there is obviously a core secretary who has to hold it together somehow or coordinate it, but that there are strong players who work together. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That's a challenging question. Just maybe one follow-up to my initial statement. First come the resources, then comes the work. Obviously, we do have existing resources. We have networks, we have IONET, etc. So we are happy to make that available within our capacity, but there will be more reflections on that tomorrow. So I don't want to steal any thunder. In terms of starting EBOC, you got me thinking, because I know indirectly how the process will work of implementing the 5 million euro that is being put aside by the Parliament, and it has to be spent by the Commission by a tendering process. So there isn't as such an observation center that is going to be established as of soon. The challenge is with this setup, and generally in the setting that we have, is how EBOC as a center, as activity, connects to existing processes that are regular, that have sufficient backing by countries, by the Commission, by citizen science stakeholders, etc. So I think this is what we need to think about. How can we integrate EBOC in a way to existing processes such as UNET, potentially the Knowledge Center for Biodiversity. I'm not really wanting to express a clear preference, but also connecting it to funding programs like Copernicus. Copernicus has an in situ data, not only a satellite data set. So there's different ways of means, but I think, and sorry, I stopped soon. The question is to go back to the community in the room. Camino said we need you. Everyone needs to come together here and be ready to respond to the commission and say, this is what we want this center to do. And here we are organized as citizen science stakeholders. Here we are organized as member country providers of plus. And this is how we will. This is our, we have a body, we have a spokesperson ready to engage with because otherwise that needs to be worked out in consultation dialogue, etc. And the more active anyone can be who's interested in seeing, the more momentum will there be, because obviously there's interest in making this.
Somebody willing to raise, oh, we have some questions now. So now you get an opportunity to use this. I'll just pass it into the front row and then it has to work its way up.
Oh, does it work? Does it hear me? Good. Hello, I'm Primož Kogošek from Environmental Agency of Slovenia. We are currently reporting the Water Frame Directive, the data that you saw. And with my colleagues, we are building with Life Pounds, National Biodiversity and Nature Conservation Information System. My question is, we are talking a lot about data harmonization and interoperability. And usually how it works in Europe is that there is some kind of legislation who prescribes exactly strict data models that we have to implement in our national infrastructure. And it is very hard for us to implement and it costs us some money. My question is, did you think about reversing this or coming closer to minimize administrative burden of the countries, and that harmonization would be done within administration of, let's say, a project like EuropaBON? So maybe we will just agree about basic principles of data models, and then you would harmonize data from member countries within the administration, because it would be more flexible. I would argue it will be cheaper, and it will suit the purpose of data. So we can collect our data for our countries. We can use it, and you can use it for your purpose. That would be my question.
Thank you. Is somebody from the panel or from the audience? So Henrik is looking apprehensive. Maybe you want to answer. Daniel?
Here. So some of the, I wanted to highlight that there is two types of data harmonization that we're talking about, or even more. We're talking about data harmonization of the biodiversity observations of the raw data so that you can derive some variables or indicators. That's one type of data harmonization. The data harmonization of those indicators or variables. And then you could even go maybe a level higher, and the harmonization of the reporting itself, because then there is some reporting that needs to be done. And I think we are fully aware of the costs of harmonization. In reality, it's always, in many of these approaches, it's better to have ways of translating to a common format than forcing everyone to have a common format because of all these additional costs. Unless you are developing from scratch. If you're starting from scratch, but if you have already a system, you have, if you have some history, forcing a big change, it's rarely a good idea. But I think we are appreciative of that, but I think the highest challenge is, or the largest challenge is to harmonize at these different levels. And it's very heterogeneous, because particularly as you go to the way that we are publishing the raw observations, it's a bit, despite we have been having GB standards like Darwin, Darwin Event Core, and now the Humboldt Core, and other standards. It's really very heterogeneous. There's, I would say, most biodiversity data that is being monitored is not yet being published in a way that facilitates harmonization. The standards, for instance, for the indicators or for the EBVs themselves, well, we have been working in GeoBON in the EBV cube standard, but we are just in the very early stages of having something that can be widely used. And then in the reporting, the ETCB has been developing with the EEA this ReportNet tool for reporting, harmonization, and so on. So I think we are, and there I think we are much more advanced already. It's also, let's say, easier because it's that end. But I think it's important to have these hierarchical levels of standardization I'm talking about.
Yeah, so exactly as Henrik said, but like in our case, in the beginning of the work, 21, 22, we interviewed all the representatives of different countries, and one part of these interviews was to get the state of the art of the current situation and a little bit of the complexity of the national networks who are really in charge of doing this monitoring and then compiling that. The third item was about discuss about this data interoperability and the EBVs. And the EBV concept was brand new for most of our partners, but they were very enthusiastic about that because they really saw that that could kind of like a big framework with harmonized already the very scattered and the diverse monitoring schemes in this kind of logical framework of different dimensions of biodiversity. But then another level of this is definitely the data itself and the data infrastructures, what you need to get all the data available. And as we saw, many member states might have the data somewhere in different laptops, but not really in a centralized system and not even reported together with these directive reports to the EEA. It's still there somewhere with no accessibility or findability. So there's a lot to do.
Maybe short answer so that we can have one more question. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I think that what we would argue in GBIF is that if we can get help and support in formatting the raw data in a way that it is then interoperable and then can flow up into EBVs and to indicators and indeed to the directive reporting, that's the key step which can unlock many of these other needs. And we do have, and just to kind of get some integration here, that really is the function and the purpose of GBIF nodes. That's if countries have those data specialists who are able to support the formatting of that raw data to make sure that heavy lifting is taken care of, then the burden should not be so great. And once it's done, that data is in there to be used for multiple purposes. So I think that would be our kind of pitch, to really focus on that lower the base level of interoperable data. We heard from Anna, for example, that in some cases the data flowing into the Water Framework Directive in Nordic countries is flowing into GBIF, but often in a rather indirect form via their species data service. If it could be more routine that all of that type of data was formatted into sampling event format so that it would then retain a lot of the original context, then that could help, I think, for that sort of bottom-up data flow, which could then support the reporting itself.
Shall we just take another question? Are we take questions first of all, the lady in the back? Sana.
Okay, it works fine. So hi, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Sandra Luque from INRAE, France, but I'm here as a devaluator of EuropaBON. So anyway, so I went through all the documents in detail and great stuff. But the question is, in terms of a book that we are discussing here, and in terms of all the work that you develop. Well, first of all, you provide two deliverables that I think will be important to look in detail in terms of the bottlenecks and in terms of the gaps, that this needs perhaps more discussion to really help build up this EBOC thing. But the main issue, I'm talking also with the community, is everything that is underrepresented, which is the marine realm, that tomorrow we're going to discuss a bit more on that. But we know there's an underrepresentation of the marine realm. There's also the genetic and evolution community, which you talk about eDNA, but actually there's a very strong genetic and evolution community in Europe that at the very moment they are having a very important workshop in Montpellier, actually on discussing all the methods and how to improve biodiversity monitoring and so on. This community, sorry to say, but it's not part of EuropaBON yet. I'm also, I see the EOS community and Copernicus. I'm part of that community. And even if you talk about remote sensing, it's really not incorporated in terms not just of remote sensing, but Earth observing systems, and in particular, everything that we develop in terms of infrastructure from the European Space Agency and in Copernicus, because there we have actually an infrastructure that will help to work in terms of data streams, on operationalizing data streams, interoperability, and also APIs that we didn't see, you know, how to develop APIs to really workflows and improve workflows. So all this is not part yet of this big plan. So my question is, when and at which moment for the future of EBOC, all this is going to be discussed, because we risk within the biodiversity monitoring community to continue with the sort of same classical methods, but as the question we have from different countries and the countries that we need is that we really operationalize and create the data flows that are needed for interoperability. So at which point this is going to be developed and by whom? And just to finish, EuropaBON is about 9 countries that so is up to date underrepresented in terms of the whole community. So before we go to the international and super international, I think it will be important to look all the work we did so far from the EuropaBON and without funding practically, and also really think on representativity at the European level in all these questions and also in the realms that we are missing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm watching the time a little bit. So this was about representation, both of different topics, different data, as well as countries. And there was another question here in the front. No, okay. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the extra input. Just one final word on country bottom-up initiatives. Very good. We heard that data standards, infrastructure, etc., need to be compatible. In our perspective, to achieve comparability between our assessments per country, of course, we want as much standardization as possible. I just want to say that. But we leave it at that. Your point is well received, nevertheless. In terms of the last point, of course, the consortium might want to respond, but I can also offer a reflection. I think from the start, it was clear that marine was not the primary target, but there has been a dialogue, and we see there's, of course, work ongoing in that domain. I would say when it comes to satellite data observations and their potential, if you look at the data flows behind the EBVs that are proposed, there's very clear evaluation which EBVs can be supported via satellite data and which require other types of data. And this is based on a scientific assessment, what variables you can monitor from space and which variables are better monitored via other methods. So I think there is an engagement. And I would say, as someone who works with the Copernicus team at the EA, in using satellite data for eastern extended counts, eastern condition, we don't have quite the right data, and we don't have certainly not the right capacity to develop the data sets that we need for ecosystem extended counts at level 1, at the most easy level. So there's a lot of potential in satellite methods, but needs to be an additional investment that complements the hardware with personnel and with in situ ground truth observations to get the maximum out of it.
Camino, let's have two more, but then we have to close. And also we would like to invite you afterwards all on stage for a group photo. So, but we have two more. Where's the queue? Okay, here to the gentleman in the blue shirt. And then Camino.
Thank you. I have a comment. My name is Peter Albacera. I work for Antwerp Zoo in Belgium. And I'm also part of two networks called Dynamo and Genoa. And they kind of respond to what you asked for about engaging new other organizations, the EBOC. And the two organizations I mentioned, Dynamo and Genoa, they work on these genetic components, the genetic diversity. Dynamo, for example, is already involved through Biodiversity Plus in this, because we are funded by Diversity Plus. And Genoa will be funded by the cost action, another network. So we are actually available to help all of you to implement the genetic indicators, which also approved by the GTF in 2 years ago. So we are ready to help countries to implement these indicators with these networks.
Thank you. Then over to Camino.
Thank you very much. I just want to have a quick reaction. Thank you, Sandra, very much for your questions and your remarks. Let me just differentiate two things. One thing is EuropaBON. Of course, this project is finishing in a couple of days. It's coming to an end, and it was proposed, it was funded to develop the proposals. Now the proposals have to be put in place if the Commission wants, so that there is a separation between what the EuropaBON proposes and then what the actual implementation will be. So of course in EuropaBON there were, among the majority of partners, there were not a lot of marine experts, but there were, in the showcases, for instance, there were freshwater and terrestrial, but in all the workshops, in all the consultations, the marine community was approached. In the workflow, for instance, the marine EBVs are perfectly covered, or not perfectly, but at the same level as the others. They were analyzed also for the selection of those EBVs. And at least when it comes to the EBOC proposal, we had a lot of bilaterals, a lot of discussions with individual projects, with networks of researchers, and with infrastructure, with ethics, trying to reflect on what are their needs. But if the question is who will coordinate it, that's to be seen. What we know is that we need everybody on board because the expertise is dispersed, and only going EBV per EBV we can do so. Otherwise, this is massive. We are lost into vague concepts. So only once we go down EBOC, we go down and start working in one particular EBV, then that community is to be reached out. The genetic community, of course, they have to be reached out. They have to be the ones defining how to make the FAIR principles implemented in their data sets, how to put them together. And, this is, I think, step by step is going to be hard for the Commission and anybody. But I mean, do not focus on how many EuropaBON partners do we have in each country, or how many marine experts do we have in each country in EuropaBON, because the value of it is the proposals with this overview of the whole community across realms. And now, what is the next step to enhance the database?
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Camino. And I think with that, we should probably wrap up for the day, as we're holding you back from a reception we have. Enrique would like to say a final word.
Because I think it's important to distinguish genetic tools for monitoring, eDNA being classic case. And you can use eDNA to monitor many of the EBVs at species and community level, not only at the genetic level. From monitoring genetic diversity variables, you're mentioning the indicator that has been proposed in the CBD that is effective population size, or NE, but it could be allelic diversity, it could be some heterozygosity measure. Those are two distinct things that we covered both of them in EuropaBON to the extent possible that we could cover in these 3 years. So we recognize the importance of eDNA as one of the novel tools to be deployed by member states and by organizations, and we identified the EBVs where eDNA can be useful. There are also challenges to the utilization of eDNA to the scaling up, which we will go into detail, but we are preparing now also a paper on novel technologies that goes into some of those challenges across several of the approaches. And we have identified, I think it's very important for those of us that are worried about genetic diversity, that it has been really kind of, I almost tend to say forgotten in many of the reporting tools. And in EuropaBON, we bring it to the forefront. We put it as one of the 6 key dimensions of biodiversity monitoring. And we say, well, at this moment, we are very far from where we want to be. We want to invest much more on monitoring of genetic diversity. So I think now it's up for the genetic diversity monitoring community to come into EBOC, to push this agenda forward. But I think EuropaBON helped put this in the policy agenda for the future.
So thank you very much. Thank you. You almost gave the last words. We would like to thank our panel, although it was only very short. So, but the good thing is that we have a reception where everybody can mingle, and I'm sure there will be more questions. Hand over to Ian for the last word.
Thanks, Aletta. Thanks, yes. Thank a very special thanks to our panel members, and maybe a round of applause, and to all of our speakers. We'll be back here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So looking forward to have you all here tomorrow. We'll have from a policy perspective, and then several presentations from the stakeholder perspectives, and then we'll really move into a discussion around the EBOC. So looking very much forward to that. So we'd like to now, I think, close and welcome everyone up to the front to take a photo, and then we'll head on up to a reception. So thank you very much, everyone.
You did it. Good, thank you.
Everybody feel free to come to the front. We somehow have to fit on the stage. And we would like to thank everybody online, obviously, for participating as well. We're going to take your questions tomorrow. Okay. Thank you.
My computer. Actually, it's not here. You can close it from now.